The sky wasn't right. It was too low, too gray, and it didn't smell like corn, but like something alive and ancient. That's how a 1,000-year-old forest smells, one that has never seen a saw. He sat down. His head was spinning. His hands felt foreign. Not his hands. Thinner, more sinewy, with calluses not from a steering wheel, but from something else. He looked at his palms and slowly clenched his fingers. They work. That's good enough. Then he raised his head and saw the village. It stood half a mile away from him, crooked roofs made of weathered wood, a fence of uneven stakes driven into the ground without any order, smoke from chimneys, a muddy trail instead of a road, the Middle Ages, or a very convincing reenactment. Ethan turned in the other direction and saw the forest. The forest stood like a wall, not like a forest in Iowa, not like a row of trees along a highway. It was a solid, black mass of trees rising so high that the treetops were lost in the clouds. And this forest was breathing, not metaphorically. Ethan could see the branches moving without any wind, as if something shimmering deep within, between the trunks, green, cold, alive. He stood up. He staggered. Beneath his feet was a field, 30 acres of brown rock and moss abutting directly against that black wall. The field was dead. Not a single cultivated plant, not a single furrow, just rocks and moss and scrawny shrubs along the edges. Ethan looked at this field the way a third-generation farmer looks at a plot of land they're trying to sell to pay off debts, with professional distaste and quiet interest. Then he noticed a bush in the corner of the field. The bush was strange. Its leaves folded up when Ethan took 3 steps closer. They folded on their own, like a sensitive plant. But sensitive plants don't grow in temperate climates, and they certainly don't grow to the waist of a grown man. Ethan crouched down and reached out his hand. The leaves closed tighter. He pulled his hand back. The leaves opened. He reached out again. They closed. He pulled his hand back. They opened. A reaction to body heat or a breeze, or to something not mentioned in his botany textbooks. Ethan exhaled slowly. He heard footsteps behind him. He turned around. A man was walking toward him, not very tall, broad-shouldered, with a face the color of old brick and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in a long time. He was holding a stamped piece of paper. The man stopped 5 steps away and began to speak. Ethan didn't understand a word. The language was unfamiliar, but he recognized the intonation instantly. That's how the bank clerks who came to inventory the property used to speak at home. Here's your plot. Here are your boundaries. Here's your deadline. Good luck. The man held out the paper to him. Ethan took it. He looked at the unfamiliar letters. He looked at the seal in the corner. He looked at the field behind him. He looked at the forest. He looked at the village. Then back at his hands. He was dead, or asleep, or had gone mad. But the ground beneath his feet was real. He could smell it. He could feel it springing beneath his soles. He could feel the dampness of the air on his skin. It was real earth. Poor soil. Acidic. Almost hopeless. But real. Ethan Marsh folded the paper and tucked it into his belt. Then he bent down. He scooped up a handful of soil, rubbed it between his fingers, sniffed it, licked it, spit it out. 4.5, maybe 4 and 7. It needs lime. It needs compost. It needs time. He straightened up and headed toward the village. Because no matter where he ended up or what was happening here, the farmer's first rule remained the same. Get to know your neighbors. Find water. Start with the soil. The village was called Hollowbrook. He realized this on the second day when the language began to become clearer. Not right away. First, individual words, then short phrases. By the end of the second day, he understood about a third of it and could respond with a dozen words that sounded like gibberish but got the meaning across. His body remembered the language. His mind did not. It was as if he had taken over the body of someone who had lived and died here, and the memory remained in the muscles of his mouth, but not in his brain. The village was small. 12 households, a little over 60 people, counting the elderly and children. Houses made of weathered oak with thatched roofs. One well for everyone. One church. One barn, 2/3 of which was empty. Ethan walked around the whole place in half a day. The village fields lay south of the houses, long-standing narrow strips divided by boundaries. Wheat, rye, a little barley. Everything planted the same way. No crop rotation. The same crop in the same field year after year. Ethan looked at it and wanted to scream. They were killing their land, slowly, methodically, from generation to generation. Nitrogen was being leached from the soil, and no one was replenishing it. In 10 years, these fields would yield half as much. In 20, they'd be abandoned. But right now, he was worried about something else. On the third day, he saw a sick little girl, the blacksmith's daughter. Her name was Ella. She was 7 years old and had been lying on a bench in her father's house, unable to move, for a week. The blacksmith's name was Brant, a huge, gray-haired man with hands like two ham hocks and eyes filled with a quiet, murky despair. He let Ethan in only because no one else had come. Ethan sat down next to the girl. He looked at her, pale, gray lips, white fingernails, colorless gums, cloudy eyes, dull and brittle. He took her hand. It was cold. Her pulse was weak and rapid. He knew what this was. He'd seen it at home. Not in people, in goats, in cows on poor pastures. Iron deficiency anemia. The body doesn't get enough iron and stops producing normal red blood cells. The blood cannot carry oxygen. The organs suffocate. If left untreated, the child will die in a week or two. Ethan asked Brant what they had treated her with. Brant said that Father Anselm had prayed over her for 3 days and given her holy water. It didn't help. Then an herbalist from a neighboring village came and gave her a decoction made from oak bark. It made things worse. Ethan stood up and walked out of the house. He was heading toward the forest, toward that very black wall of trees that everyone in the village kept their distance from, toward those very bushes with leaves that fold up at the slightest touch. Sensitive mimosa, or its local equivalent. Back home, people made tea from it that was rich in iron and vitamin C. If the same biocurrently is at work here, and judging by the leaves' reaction, it does, then a handful of these leaves could save the girl. He stepped into his field. He walked past the rocks, past the moss. He approached the bush. The leaves folded shut. Ethan sat down nearby and waited. 10 minutes later, the leaves opened. He carefully plucked 3 branches. The leaves on the remaining branches closed up, but not all of them. The bush was getting used to him. He returned to the village. On the way, he found what he was looking for: stinging nettles. Thick thickets by the fence behind the village headman's house. Everyone gave them a wide berth. For Ethan, they were iron, potassium, vitamins. For free. He picked up an armful with his bare hands. His hands were burning, but he endured it. Then he went into Brant's house. He asked for hot water, boiling water. Brant looked at him as if he were crazy, but he gave him the boiling water. Ethan brewed the mimosa leaves. He added nettles. He crushed the eggshells he'd found in the trash pile by the chicken coop and added them to the mixture. Calcium. Without it, iron isn't absorbed. A green, murky sludge. It smelled like a swamp. He cooled it down to lukewarm and brought it to the girl's lips. Ella didn't open her eyes. He poured it in, drop by drop, slowly, patiently. Brant stood nearby, silent. His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Ethan poured half a mug and stopped. He told Brant to give her half a mug 3 times a day, in the morning, at noon, in the evening, and to wait. Brant asked what kind of herb it was. Ethan said they were leaves from his field, from the field by the forest. Brant fell silent. Something dark flashed in his eyes. Everyone in the village knew that the field by the forest was a cursed place. You weren't supposed to touch anything that grew there. The church says that everything from the wild forest is tainted, but his daughter was dying, and no one but this strange outsider had come. Brant nodded. On the second day, nothing had changed, nor on the third. Ethan came in the morning and in the evening. He brewed his green concoction. He administered it drop by drop. He adjusted the proportions. He added more nettles. He found wild sorrel by the stream and added that too. Vitamin C. It helps with iron absorption. On the 4th day, Ella opened her eyes. On the 5th day, she asked for food. Her voice was as thin as a thread, but she was speaking. Brant stepped out of the house and stood in the yard with his back to the door, his massive shoulders shaking. By evening, the whole village knew about it. A stranger from the cursed land had cured Brant's daughter with tainted herbs from the wild woods. The reaction was mixed. Half the people looked at Ethan with cautious interest, the other half with outright fear. Father Anselm came to see Ethan in the field on the 6th day. He was short and thin, with a kind face and anxious eyes. He didn't shout or threaten. He quietly asked Ethan if he knew that using tainted plants was a sin against the bright span. Ethan replied that he knew the girl was dying and that now she was eating. Anselm was silent for a moment. Then he said he was glad for the child, but that rules were rules, and that if word got out in town, there would be consequences. Ethan nodded. He understood the main point. Anselm isn't an enemy. Anselm is scared. The fence grew slowly. Brant came every morning and chopped steaks until noon. Then he'd go to the blacksmith shop, because he had orders, and a family. Ethan was left alone. He didn't complain. A fence is good, but a fence isn't the main thing. The main thing is compost. On the 9th day after his arrival, Ethan walked around the entire village. every yard, every garbage pit, every manure pile. He was looking for organic matter, waste, anything people threw away. He found plenty. Chicken manure piled behind the houses was rotting in the open air, losing its nitrogen. Food scraps lay in the ditches, attracting rats. Ash from the stoves was spread on the road to keep it from getting muddy. Straw from threshing was burned in the fields. Ethan looked at all this and saw gold. Every manure pile is nitrogen. Every bucket of ash was potassium and calcium. Every sack of straw was carbon that held it all together. They were throwing away their harvest, literally. He started collecting it. He went from house to house and asked permission to take the waste. People looked at him as if he were a madman. A stranger from the cursed field collecting trash. Someone tapped their finger against their temple. Someone else just turned away. But they gave him the trash willingly. Why did he need it? On his own field, Ethan dug a hole, 2 steps wide, 3 steps long, 1.5 steps deep, with his hands and a stick, because he didn't have a shovel. Brant saw this in the evening, and the next day brought him a shovel. An old one, with a broken handle, but it still worked. Ethan fixed the handle by wrapping a strip of leather around the break, and continued digging. A second hole, a third. By the end of the 10th day, he had 3 compost pits. Into the first went manure mixed with straw. Into the second, he put food scraps mixed with ash. In the third, he piled everything he'd found in his field, moss, weeds, and that same acidic clay from the topsoil. And he added mimosa leaves, not the ones used for Ella's medicine, but the fallen ones, dry ones. He noticed that the soil around the mimosa bush was darker than anywhere else, softer. It had more worms in it. The mimosa was doing something to the soil, fixing nitrogen, or secreting something through its roots. He didn't know for sure, but the signs were obvious. This was the first hint that the magical plants of Decolesia operated on the same principles as Earth's biology, just faster, stronger, more intense. Ethan made a mental note of this and continued working. The days passed. The fence grew. The compost matured. Ethan laid out the first garden beds, 6 of them, each 3 steps long and 1 step wide. He raised them a palm's width above field level for better drainage. He used stones for the base. On top, he laid a layer of compost from the first pit, mixed with clay. The result was poor but usable soil. He didn't have any seeds. He went to see the village elder. The elder listened to him in silence. Ethan asked for a handful of wheat seeds, just 1 handful. The village head refused. He said the grain was carefully counted and there was none to spare. Ethan didn't argue. He went to the granary and looked at how the grain was stored. The sacks stood on the dirt floor, no pallets, no ventilation. The humidity in the room was so high that Ethan could feel it on his skin. A third of the grain was moldy. He could tell by the color, the smell, and the way the grains had clumped together in the corners of the sacks. They were losing a third of their supply every season simply because of improper storage. Ethan didn't mention it, not yet anyway. Instead, he went out to the village fields after the harvest and began gathering what was left. Ears of grain that had fallen during the harvest, grains that had spilled onto the ridges, weed seeds growing between the rows. Not weeds, he looked closer. Wild sorrel, stinging nettles, plantain, dandelion. Everything the locals pulled up and burned was food, or medicine, or fertilizer. They were sitting on a gold mine and didn't even know it. In 2 weeks, Ethan gathered enough seeds to plant 3 garden beds. Wheat took up 1. The second was planted with a mixture of wild sorrel, stinging nettles, and some local plant that looked like spinach. In the third, he planted mimosa seeds, 4 seeds from pods he'd found under a bush in his field. If the mimosa fixes nitrogen, then by the end of the growing season, the soil around it will be 3 times richer. It was an experiment, the first of many. On the 15th day, something new happened. Ethan was working in the field when he heard a sound, quiet, cautious, a rustle in the bushes at the edge of the forest. He froze. He didn't turn his head. He didn't move. He just waited. A beast emerged from the underbrush. Not a wolf, not a fox, something in between, about the size of a large dog. Red fur with silvery stripes on the sides, a long snout, erect ears, a long bushy tail, yellow eyes, and intelligent, too intelligent for an animal. The creature stood at the edge of the woods and looked at Ethan, not with aggression, not with hunger, with curiosity. Ethan knew that look. It's how young coyotes look at farmers in Iowa when they go out into the fields at night and stumble upon a person who isn't yelling or throwing rocks. Interest without fear. For now, without fear. Ethan slowly crouched down. He made himself look smaller. He lowered his eyes. He didn't look directly at it. A direct gaze is a challenge. Any zoologist knows that. He sat and waited. The animal stood and watched. A minute passed. 2. 5. The animal snorted, turned around, walked into the woods, but it didn't run away. It just walked away, calmly. Ethan exhaled. His heart was pounding, not from fear, from excitement. It was the first large animal he'd seen on this side of the edge, and it hadn't attacked. It hadn't been scared. It had come to look. That evening, he left a piece of bread at the edge of the field and the forest, his dinner. In the morning, the bread was gone. There were tracks left on the ground, the same paws, the same beast. Ethan smiled and left another piece. That's how the longest training session of his life began. Or perhaps not training, getting to know each other. Meanwhile, the village went about its business, and life there was no laughing matter. Ethan pieced things together bit by bit, listening to conversations at the well and in the village headman's hut. This year's harvest was poor, worse than last year's, and last year's was worse than the year before that. The land was running out of steam. The people were running out of steam along with it. The tithe paid to Lord Trevine took up a third. Another tenth was taken by the church. What remained was enough to last until spring if the winter was mild. If the winter was harsh, someone would die, usually the old folks, or the children, quietly, without drama. They simply wouldn't wake up in the morning. Ethan listened and counted. 60 people, 12 farms, 400 acres of arable land, if you counted all the plots, including his damned 30. 10 cows, 20 goats, 50 chickens, 1 horse, and that one was lame. With proper carb rotation and adequate fertilizer, 400 acres could feed 200 people, easily, with plenty to spare. Here, they could barely feed 60. The problem wasn't the land. The land was fine. Not perfect, but workable. The problem was in their heads, in how they thought about the land, as an enemy that had to be forced to yield bread, rather than as a partner that needed to be fed so it could feed you. But Ethan couldn't just walk up to them and say all that. They wouldn't listen. He's an outsider. He lives on that cursed field. He heals people with tainted herbs. To them, he was strange at best, dangerous at worst. He needed results, proof, something they could see with their own eyes and couldn't deny. And for that, he needed time. The red beast came every night. Ethan left food in the same spot, always at the edge of the field and the forest. Always a single piece, no more. Not bread every time. Sometimes turnip scraps he'd beg from his neighbor. Sometimes a handful of grain he'd gathered in the fields after the harvest. Once, a dead mouse he'd found in the barn. On the 4th morning, he saw tracks closer to the garden beds. The beast was approaching the greenhouse. It sniffed at the walls. It didn't go inside, but it kept coming. Ethan knew the rule: never rush a wild animal. Patience is the only tool that always works. He kept leaving food out, and every day he sat at the edge of the field with his back to the woods. He didn't turn around. He didn't look. He just sat there. He worked with his hands. He sorted through seeds. He cleaned his tools. He let the animal get used to his silhouette, to his scent, to the sound of his breathing. On the 22nd day, the animal came out in broad daylight. Ethan was working in the garden when he felt a gaze. He looked up slowly. The animal was standing 10 paces away, in the field, not at the edge of the woods, in the field, watching. Ethan didn't move. The beast sat down, wrapped its tail around its paws, sat and watched as the man dug in the dirt. 5 minutes, 10, then it stood up and left. But it left across the field, not back into the woods, across the field to the far edge, and only then into the undergrowth. It had marked its territory. Ethan found the mark that evening. The beast considered the field its own, or shared. In any case, it was progress. Ethan named it Red. Not very original, but accurate. At the end of the 3rd week, an event occurred that changed the situation. A woman came to see Ethan, Mary Holloway, 28 years old, a widow. Her husband had died 2 years ago from red sickness, the very same anemia that had nearly killed Ella. Mary was sturdy, broad-shouldered, with large red hands, and a face that clearly showed she hadn't slept properly in a very long time. She came to Ethan's field in the morning and stood by the fence until he noticed her. Ethan approached. Mary said she had nothing to eat, that her supplies had run out, that the neighbors had helped the first year, but stopped the second because they didn't have enough themselves. She said this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, as a fact. Ethan looked at her, at her hands, at the way she stood, firmly, steadily. This woman was no beggar. This woman was a worker. She just had nowhere to put her strength. He asked if she knew how to identify herbs. Mary said no. Ethan said he'd teach her, and that he'd pay her with food, the food they would grow together. Mary looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She came the next morning before dawn, and the next, and every morning after that. Mary worked like a machine, without breaks, without complaint. She weeded so thoroughly that not a single extra stem remained in the garden bed. She carried water from the stream until Ethan dug a ditch for irrigation. She mixed the compost with her bare hands and didn't wrinkle her nose at the smell. Ethan taught her, every day. This is stinging nettle. It's edible if you blanch it with boiling water. It contains iron. It improves your blood. This is sorrel. It's sour, but it's full of nutrients. If the leaves are yellow, it means the soil is too wet. If they're red, it means the soil is too acidic. These are earthworms. They're a farmer's best friends. Where there are lots of earthworms, there's good soil. Mary listened. She memorized everything. She didn't write anything down because she didn't know how to write, but she remembered everything. A week later, she could distinguish 15 types of plants by touch and smell. 2 weeks later, she could tell just by looking at a garden bed what was wrong with it. Ethan was impressed. Mary had a natural talent for observation. She saw what others missed. The little things, how the stems leaned, where the soil was darker, where the ants were crawling from. Once, she showed Ethan a spot by the stream where the grass grew twice as tall as everywhere else. Ethan checked the soil. Silt, river silt, rich in minerals. Perfect. In 3 days, they hauled 20 buckets of silt to the garden beds. The result was visible within a week. The wheat sprouts in the row with the silt were 2 fingers taller than those in the others. Mary looked at it and said it was a miracle. Ethan said it wasn't a miracle, but river silt. Mary looked at him as if he'd said something both very silly and very important at the same time. Meanwhile, the first month was drawing to a close, and Ethan faced his first serious problem. Food was running out. The garden beds were yielding their first greens, but it wasn't enough. Nettles and sorrel are fine, but you can't survive on them alone. He needed meat, he needed fat, he needed calories. Ethan didn't know how to hunt. Fishing required gear he didn't have. He thought about it for 2 days and came to the only conclusion: the forest. Everyone was afraid of the wild forest. Everyone gave it a wide berth. But Ethan had seen that Red came back from the forest well fed, so there was food in the forest. The question was whether he could get it. On the morning of the first day of the second month, Ethan got up at first light. He grabbed a shovel, a knife, and a rope and headed into the forest. Not too deep, 50 steps from the edge, no further. The forest greeted him with silence. No, not silence, with sounds he didn't recognize. A hum, a crackling, something like singing, but too low for a bird. The trees here were enormous, trunks 3 arm spans wide. The bark was dark, almost black, with veins of green. Moss covered everything. The ground gave way softly under his feet, soft, loose, full of life. Ethan crouched down and scooped up a handful. He rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. His eyes widened. It was the best soil he'd ever seen in his life. Rich, dark, with a perfect structure, full of mycelium and roots and organisms he couldn't identify. If he could transport this soil to his garden beds, the harvest would triple. But he couldn't take the soil, too heavy, too far to carry. Instead, he could take something else. He began to search and found it. Mushrooms, not ordinary ones, with caps the size of a plate, pale blue, glowing with a faint shimmer even in daylight. Ethan sniffed them, not poisonous. At least, Earth's counterparts with a similar structure aren't poisonous. The gills were clean. The flesh was firm. It smelled like mushrooms. Good. He picked one, put it in his bag. He walked on. He found berries, dark purple, large, on bushes with leaves that quivered as he approached. The same mimosa-like reflexes. The berries smelled like blueberries. He tasted one, waited an hour. His stomach didn't hurt. He didn't feel dizzy. The taste was like blueberries, only sweeter and with a hint of something floral. He gathered a full handful. On the way back, he found something else. Nuts, large, in thick green shells, on the ground beneath a tree with silvery bark. Ethan cracked one open with a stone. Inside was a kernel the size of a walnut, white, oily. He ate it. It tasted like a cashew, rich, fatty, high in calories. He gathered as many as he could carry. He returned to the field around noon. Mary was waiting for him by the garden beds. She looked at the bag and her face turned pale. Ethan dumped his finds onto the ground. Mary recoiled. She said they were from the forest, that they were spoiled, that they were inedible. Ethan picked up a mushroom. He bit off a piece. He chewed it. He swallowed it. Mary watched him in horror. Ethan said he'd eaten these mushrooms 3 hours ago and was still alive, that the berries tasted like blueberries, that the nuts were better than any he'd ever tasted. Mary said nothing. Ethan offered her a nut, just one. Mary didn't move. He placed the nut on the log between them. He said she could try it whenever she wanted, or not try it. It was her choice. He went back to work. An hour later, the nut was gone from the log. Ethan didn't turn his head. Mary didn't say anything either. But the next day, she asked if there were any more nuts like that in the forest. From that day on, they went into the woods together. Not too far in, 50 steps, sometimes 70. Ethan showed her what was safe and what wasn't. Simple rules. A bright color with no smell means be careful. A bitter taste means spit it out. If a bush moves when you approach it, it means it's alive, and you shouldn't touch it until you understand why it's moving. Mary listened. She memorized everything. Within a week, she was finding mushrooms faster than Ethan. She had a knack for it. Meanwhile, Red began coming not only at night. He'd show up in the field during the day. He'd sit off to the side. He'd watch. Once, when Ethan and Mary returned from the woods, he was standing by the greenhouse, sniffing the glass. Mary froze. Ethan told her to stay put. He walked 5 steps toward Red. He sat down on the ground. Red looked at him. Ethan took a nut out of his bag and placed it on the ground in front of him. Red walked over, sniffed it, picked up the nut, cracked it open, ate it, looked at Ethan. Ethan placed another one down. Red ate that one too. After the third nut, he sat down next to Ethan just 2 steps away. Mary, standing behind him, held her breath. Ethan held out his hand, palm up. Red sniffed it, licked it, and walked away, but he didn't run off. He walked calmly across the field toward the woods. Mary exhaled and said that Ethan was either the bravest person she'd ever met or the craziest. Ethan replied that there's a saying in Iowa, if an animal doesn't run away from you or bite you, it means it's thinking, and you can always come to an understanding with a thinking animal. Mary asked what Iowa was. Ethan paused and said it was the place he came from, a very distant place. By the end of the first month, Ethan took stock. 6 garden beds were in use. The wheat was sprouting. Compost was maturing in 3 pits. The greenhouse was maintaining its temperature. Mary had become a reliable worker and was a quick learner. Red had stopped being afraid and came by every day. There was enough food in the woods to keep them from going hungry. Ella Brandt walked around the yard on her own and even ran. Her complexion had returned to normal. Ethan continued to prepare a decoction for her every 2 days. It was a beginning, tiny, fragile, but real. However, every beginning has a price, and Ethan paid his price on the 31st day. Father Anselm didn't come alone. A month, 30 days. Ethan counted every single one. On the 2nd day after Corvin's visit, he drew up a plan. Not on paper, in his head. 3 prongs. First, food. He needed to grow enough that it would be impossible to deny the results. Not for himself, for the village. Second, allies. He needed people who would stand up for him when the time came, not out of fear, out of self-interest. Third, knowledge. He needed to understand how this world's magic worked, not as sorcery, as biology, as a system. Because if he understood the system, he would be able to explain it in a language that even the church couldn't reject. He started with food. The compost from the first pit had matured. Dark, crumbly, smelling like earth after rain. Perfect. Ethan spread it over the garden beds. He added river silt. He added shredded mimosa leaves, ash from the stoves, which Mary now collected from the neighbors every morning. The garden beds were transforming before his eyes. The wheat, which on ordinary village soil produced thin, pale stalks, stood thick and dark green in his beds, a full palm's height taller. Ethan knew why. Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, the 3 pillars of fertility. The locals didn't know a single one of those words. To them, the earth either produced a crop or it didn't, just like a cow. And if it didn't produce, it meant God had turned his back on them. Ethan was going to show them that God had nothing to do with it. But first, he needed more land. The 30 acres of his plot were a vast expanse. The problem was that 20 of them were rock, bare rock on which nothing grew. Clearing 20 acres of rock by hand would take years. Ethan didn't have years. He had a month. He looked at the forest again, at the forest floor, at that rich, dark soil teeming with life. And he thought again. You can't move the soil, but you can move what makes the soil, mycelium. On the 3rd day, he went into the forest and gathered mycelium, the white threads permeating the top layer of soil. Carefully, without tearing them, he scraped off thin layers of soil containing the mycelium and carried them to the field. He laid them on the stony ground. He covered them with compost. He watered them, and he waited. The results came a week later. The mycelium had taken root. It was spreading out from the planting sites across the surface of the stone, clinging to the moss and organic matter, slowly but surely. Wherever it passed, the stone began to crumble. The mycelium secreted an acid that broke down the mineral matrix. Bio-watering. On land, this process takes decades. Here, it was happening right before his eyes. Within a week, a strip of rock 3 steps wide was covered with a thin layer of something resembling soil. Not real soil, not yet, but it was a start. Ethan watched this, and his hands trembled. Not from fatigue, from excitement. The magic of this world accelerated biological processes. Not 10-fold, 100-fold, maybe 1,000-fold. The wild forest's mycelium did in a week what Earth's mycelium would take centuries to accomplish. If he was right, in a month he wouldn't have 30 acres of rock, but 30 acres of arable land. Not the best, but arable. He shared his observation with Mary. Mary said it was witchcraft. Ethan said it was the mushrooms. Mary gave him that look. Meanwhile, Red had become part of their daily routine. The animal would come in the morning and leave in the evening. Sometimes he'd lie in the field while Ethan worked. Sometimes it accompanied him to the woods and waited at the edge while the man walked among the trees. Once it brought Ethan a dead rabbit. It laid it at his feet and sat down. Ethan looked at the rabbit. He looked at Red. He understood. The beast was sharing its catch. In the animal world, that means one thing. You're part of the pack. Ethan took the rabbit. He cut it into 2 pieces. He gave one to Red. He brought the other to Mary. They made a stew. It was their first meat in a long time. Mary ate in silence. Ethan saw her hands trembling. Not from the cold. Allies. That was the second approach. Ethan couldn't convince the village with lectures, but he could win people over. Every person he fed became an argument in his favor. Ella ran around the village, and everyone saw that the girl who had been dying was now healthy. Brant worked in his field, and everyone saw that the blacksmith had sided with the stranger. Mary came every day, and everyone saw that the widow they'd considered a burden was now well-fed and busy. But that wasn't enough. Ethan needed someone with clout, someone with authority, and he knew who that was. An old man named Gareth, 72 years old, a former soldier, a former farmer, now just an old man whom people tolerated because his son paid his share of the tithe. Gareth lived in the smallest house on the outskirts of the village, alone. His wife had died 5 years ago. His son lived in the city and came to visit once a year. Gareth had no teeth, almost none, just 3 lower incisors. He subsisted on porridge and sometimes soggy bread. Ethan came to him with a bowl of pumpkin soup. He'd found the pumpkin in the woods, wild, small, but sweet. He'd boiled it down to a puree. Gareth could eat it without teeth. The old man looked at the bowl. He looked at Ethan. He picked up a spoon. He ate. Then he looked again, and his eyes grew moist. He said he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something sweet. Ethan came to see him every evening, with a bowl, with conversation. Garrett turned out to be a sharp old man. His memory was better than that of young people. He remembered things that others had forgotten or never knew. He remembered that 50 years ago, the forest had been 200 paces farther away. That a family used to live on the edge of the forest, trading in wild herbs, and no one had ever bothered them. That the law against tainted gifts had been introduced only 30 years ago, after the new archbishop declared a crusade against the wild forest. Before that, people had roamed the forest freely. Ethan listened and memorized every fact, every date, every name. It was a weapon, not a sword. Information. If the law was enacted 30 years ago, then it can be challenged. That means there are people who remember the time before the law. That means church doctrine isn't an eternal truth, but a political decision made by a specific person. Gareth told him something else. Lord Trevane, Cassius Trevane. He hadn't always been lord of these lands. His father had received the fief 40 years ago from the crown for his service in the border war. Before the Trevanes, the Oldmores had ruled the land. The Oldmores were more lenient. The tithe was lower under them. The peasants lived more freely, but the Oldmores fell out of favor at court, and their lands were transferred to the Trevanes. Cassius grew up in the capital. He was educated, intelligent, and absolutely convinced that commoners are tools, not people, tools for working the land, like a plow, like a sickle. Only one that could speak. Ethan listened and understood. His enemy was no fool, no caricatured villain, a man with a system of beliefs, with logic, with power, and with the legal right to do everything he does. There was only one way to defeat such a man, to make his system stop working, to make the people he considered tools start thinking like human beings. On the 12th day of the month, Ethan received a gift he hadn't expected. Red brought a friend. The second beast was larger, darker, with gray fur and black stripes down its spine. Not a fox, more like a wolf, but not a wolf. Long legs, broad chest, heavy paws. The beast stood at the edge of the forest and didn't move until Red approached Ethan and sat down beside him. Only then did the second beast take a step, one, and froze. Ethan understood. Red had led him there. He'd shown that the man was safe. Social structure, a pack. Trust through an intermediary. Like wolves, like hyenas, like any highly organized social predator. Ethan took out a nut. He tossed it toward the second beast, not at his feet. Beside him, at a safe distance. The beast looked at the nut, then at Red. Red didn't react. The beast approached, ate it, backed away. Ethan tossed a second one. The beast ate it faster. A third, a fourth. By the fifth, it no longer backed away. On the 6th, it sat down, not next to Ethan, but next to Red. The two beasts sat in the stranger's field at the edge of the wild forest, eating nuts from his hands. Ethan named the second one Gray. Not very original, again. Exactly. By the 20th day of the month, Ethan took stock of his progress. Mycelium covered a third of the rocky area of his plot. Beneath it, a thin but real layer of soil was forming. The garden beds yielded their first harvest. There wasn't much wheat, but the greens were already feeding two people, plus wild mushrooms, berries, and nuts. Mary was settling in with growing confidence. She was already venturing into the woods alone for 50 paces and returning with a full bag. Red and Gray were right at home in the field. They weren't guarding anything, but their presence scared off the small predators that used to snatch chickens from the village. Two households noticed that ever since the animals had settled in the stranger's field, the chickens had stopped disappearing. Brant finished the fence, the entire perimeter, 30 acres. It was a massive undertaking, and Ethan didn't know how to thank the blacksmith. Then he thought about it and knew. He went into the woods. He found ore, not iron, something else. A black stone with a metallic sheen that lay in the stream bed. Ethan didn't know what kind of metal it was, but he knew Brant would be able to identify it. He brought 3 pieces. Brant took one, looked at the fracture, and his eyebrows shot up. A month had passed. Brother Corvin had not returned. Instead, a letter arrived. The village elder read it aloud in the square in front of the church. Ethan Marsh was declared a heretic of the first degree. His property was to be confiscated. The land was to be returned to the communal fund. Anyone who harbors a heretic shares in his guilt. Ethan stood in the crowd and listened. The faces around him showed a variety of emotions: fear, anger, indifference, and a few pairs of eyes that were looking not at the village elder, but at him, Brant, Mary, Gareth, and 3 others. 2 men from the outermost farms whose chickens had stopped disappearing after the animals settled on Ethan's field, and a woman holding a child in her arms who had come to him 3 days ago because the little one was coughing up blood, and the herbalist had said it was God's will. Ethan had given her a decoction made from tree bark he'd found in the forest. 2 days later, the child had stopped coughing. 6 pairs of eyes, 6 people, out of 60, but 6 is more than 0. The village elder finished reading. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at him. The village elder was a practical man, not evil, not kind, practical. He knew that the stranger had cured 2 people, that his animals scared off predators, that his garden beds were greener than anyone else's in the village, but he also knew that the church's word was law, and that Lord Trevane would support the church because it was in his interest to get rid of the stranger on the land he planned to take. The village elder said he was giving Ethan 3 days to pack his things and leave. Ethan replied that he wouldn't leave, that this land belonged to him under the land allotment law, that he had received a document with a seal, and that he had not violated a single land use law. Heretic was a charge brought by the church. Land was a matter of secular law. One did not override the other. The village head blinked. He hadn't expected a legal argument from a man who a month ago couldn't string 3 words together in the local language. Ethan wasn't the only one who knew this. Gareth knew it. The old man who remembered a time when the law worked differently, who remembered that an ecclesiastical court had no right to take away land. Only the Lord could do that, and only by decision of the royal governor. The village headman left to think it over. Ethan returned to the field. Mary was waiting for him. She asked what would happen now. Ethan said that now they would work faster. The next 3 days were the hardest since his arrival. Ethan worked 20 hours a day. Mary worked right beside him. Brant came by after work at the blacksmith's and worked until dark. They expanded the garden beds. The mycelium had done its job. The strip of former rock, 15 paces wide and stretching the length of the entire field, had turned into loose, dark soil. Not perfect, young, but suitable for planting. Ethan sowed it with everything he had: wheat, wild spinach, turnips from seeds he'd begged from a neighbor 3 weeks ago, mimosa in every 4th row, not for the harvest, for nitrogen. Mimosa fixed nitrogen in the soil just like legumes do, only 10 times faster. Each mimosa bush was a living fertilizer factory. Ethan alternated the rows: wheat, spinach, turnips, mimosa, wheat, spinach, turnips, mimosa. A crop rotation in miniature, all in one field, all in one season. The locals didn't do it that way. The locals planted the same crop across the entire field, year after year, until the soil died. 3 days passed. The village head didn't come. No one came. Ethan didn't know why. Then he found out. Lord Trevane was busy. In the northern part of his estates, 2 villages had refused to pay their tithe. Cassius had taken his men there to sort things out. Ethan was given time, not because he deserved it, because he was lucky. He wasn't going to let that luck go to waste. On the 5th day after he was declared a heretic, someone Ethan wasn't expecting came to him. A girl, young, dressed in men's clothes, with a bow on her back and a knife at her belt, dirty knees, scratched hands, dark hair pulled back into a bun, eyes like reds, yellow, alert, wild. She stood at the edge of the field and watched the beasts. Red and gray were lying by the greenhouse. They raised their heads when she appeared, but they didn't get up. They didn't growl. It was strange. They always reacted to strangers. They'd growled at Mary for the first 3 days. They'd growled at Brant for a week. They didn't react to this girl at all, as if she were part of their world. Ethan approached. The girl said her name was Juna, that she was the daughter of the forester from the village of Thornhill, a 2-day journey away, that her father had died a year ago, that she'd been going to the wildwood since she was 6, that the church had declared her tainted and no man in the area would take her as a wife, that she'd heard about a man in Hollowbrook who wasn't afraid of the forest, and she'd come to see if it was true. Ethan looked at her hands, at her eyes, at the way she stood, lightly, on the balls of her feet, ready to run or fight at any second. A person who had grown up in the woods, among the animals, who knew things no textbook could teach. He asked her one thing. Could she show him the woods? Not the edge, the woods, the real one. Juna looked at him for a long time, then at Red. Red lay still, Gray lay beside him. Not a single muscle twitched. Juna said yes. They set out the next morning. Mary stayed behind in the field. Ethan took a shovel and a bag. Juna led the way. She moved through the forest as if it were her home. Silently, confidently, she went around some trees and walked straight toward others. Sometimes she touched the bark with her palm. Sometimes she stopped and listened. Ethan followed her and watched. She knew the forest on a level that was inaccessible to him. Not scientific, intuitive, physical. She sensed the forest as a living organism and moved through it without disturbing anything. They walked 100 steps from the edge, 200, 300. The forest was changing. The trees were getting older, thicker. The moss on the trunks glowed with a soft greenish light. The air grew thicker, warmer, rich with scents that Ethan couldn't break down into their components. At 300 steps, Juna stopped. She pointed down. Beneath their feet was a stream, small, clear. The water in it was blue, not a reflection of the sky. The water itself was blue. Ethan crouched down. He touched it, warm, much warmer than it should be. He sniffed. A mineral scent, rich, like a hot spring, but without the sulfur. Juna said that animals come here to drink, that the water makes them stronger, faster, that wounded animals lie in this stream, and their wounds heal in 2 days. Ethan filled the pot he'd brought with him with water. Then he scooped up some soil from the stream's edge, black, rich, alive. On the way back, Juna showed him something else. A clearing, a small one, 20 paces across. Plants grew in the clearing that Ethan had never seen anywhere else. Stems as thick as an arm, leaves the size of a human head. Fruits hung in clusters, red, heavy, each the size of an apple. Ethan picked one, broke it open. Inside was flesh, orange, chewy, with a scent that was at once familiar and impossible. Tomato, mango, peach, all together and none of them separately. He tasted it, sweet, juicy, and something else. Warmth spread down from his throat. Not heat, not a burn, warmth. Like a sip of hot broth on a cold day, only from the inside. Ethan looked at his hands. The calluses that had been bleeding that morning had stopped hurting. The scratch on his forearm, which he'd gotten 3 days ago from a thorny bush, had healed right before his eyes. Thin pink skin where the wound had been that morning. He looked at Juna. She was looking at him calmly, as if she'd seen this 100 times. He asked if he could take the seeds. Juna said he could, but she added that these fruits don't grow outside the forest. Many had tried. Her father had tried. The seeds don't sprout in ordinary soil. Ethan gathered the seeds, 12 from the 3 fruits, and put them in a bag, separate from everything else. When they returned to the field, he immediately went to the spot where the mycelium from the forest had created new soil. Soil that had once been rock, but had become soil. Soil whose composition was closer to that of the forest than to that of the village. He planted the 3 seeds in the forest soil on his field and watered them with water from the blue stream. Juna stood nearby and watched. She didn't say anything, but she didn't leave. She didn't leave at all. Not that day. Not the next day either. Ethan offered her a place in the shed. She said she preferred to sleep outside. She spread out a hide by the greenhouse and lay down. Red came in the evening and lay down next to her, as if he'd known her forever. The days passed. Juna stayed. She didn't say much. She worked in silence, but what she did was worth 10 men's work. She brought things from the forest that Ethan couldn't find on his own. Roots for food, bark for decoctions, clay for plaster, tendons from some kind of animal that were stronger than any rope, feathers that Mary learned to use to make pillows, and information where large animals roamed in the forest, where it was dangerous, where it was safe, where there was water, where to find stones, where the trails were. Una knew the map of the wild woods for 2 days' journey into its depths. No one else in the kingdom knew that much. Ethan listened and drew a map on a flat stone with charcoal, the first map of the wild woods in the history of Hollowbrook. Meanwhile, the seeds had sprouted. After 3 days. 3 days. Ethan stood over the sprouts and couldn't believe his eyes. Forest fruits that didn't grow in ordinary soil had sprouted in the soil created by the forest mycelium. Tiny green stems were pushing through the dark, loose earth, strong, vibrant, alive. He was right. Forest soil is the key. The plants themselves aren't damaged. They just need their own soil, their own microflora, their own mycelium, their own world beneath their feet. Take that away, and they die. Give it to them, and they grow. Just like on land, just like everywhere else. Basic ecology. Only here, no one had ever looked at it from this perspective, because everyone looked at the forest from above, as if it were an enemy. But Ethan looked up from below, like an agronomist, like a man who knows that everything starts with the soil. He turned to June. She was standing nearby, looking at the sprouts. Her face looked strange, open, soft, nothing like the hard, wary face she'd arrived with. Ethan told her that she knew the forest better than anyone, that without her, he wouldn't have found the stream, the clearing, or the fruit. The 3rd month began with rain, cold rain, lingering rain. For 3 days straight, water poured from the sky without stopping, and Ethan's field turned into a swamp. The garden beds were washed away. The compost was washed out of the pits. The young shoots of wild berries were pressed to the ground. Ethan stood in the rain and watched as 2 months' work went down the drain. Then he stopped watching and started taking action. Drainage, the most tedious and most important thing in agronomy. He grabbed a shovel and began digging ditches, from the garden beds to the edge of the field, from the edge of the field to the low-lying area by the stream. Mary came out into the rain 10 minutes later. Silently, she picked up a second shovel. Juna came out 20 minutes later, without a shovel, with her bare hands. She dug with her hands like a beast. Quickly, exactly. Clay flew from under her fingers. By evening, they had dug 6 ditches. The water started flowing, slowly, murky, but it was flowing. The garden beds stopped drowning. Ethan stood knee-deep in mud, soaked to the bone, and thought about drainage pipes, about terracotta, about the clay that was in abundance all around them. We could make pipes, fire them in a kiln, lay them underground. Permanent drainage. Not ditches that get silted up over the course of a season, but a real system. He told Brant about it. The blacksmith looked at him thoughtfully. He said he could fire the clay, that he had a kiln, but that the molds for the pipes would have to be made of wood, and that it would take a week. Ethan said a week was fine. They got to work. Brant carved out the molds. Mary mixed the clay. Ethan showed them what thickness the walls should be and what diameter the pipes should have. Juna watched all this with an expression that said people were strange creatures. She didn't understand why they would dig ditches and make pipes when they could just plant on the hillsides like animals do. Ethan explained to her that animals don't plant enough wheat to feed 40 people. Juna thought about it and agreed. The first pipes were ready in 8 days. Crooked, a bit thick, but they worked. Ethan laid them under the main garden beds. He covered them with gravel from the stream, then with soil on top. When the next rain came 4 days later, the water drained away in an hour. The garden beds stayed dry. Mary looked at it and shook her head. She said that in her 30 years living in the village, not a single person had ever thought to do something like that. Ethan didn't answer. He was thinking about something else, about how the rainwater flowing through the pipes was carrying nutrients with it, nitrogen, potassium. Everything he put into the compost was being washed away. He needed a collection system, a reservoir. He dug a hole at the end of the drainage line. He lined the bottom with clay. He packed it down. The result was a pond, small, 2 steps by 3, but it worked. The water in it was murky and smelled of life. A week later, frogs had taken up residence in the pond. 2 weeks later, algae appeared. Ethan looked at his small, ugly pond and saw a system. Rain falls on the garden beds. Water seeps through the soil, drawing out excess moisture. Pipes carry the water to the pond. In the pond, the water accumulates minerals and organic matter. The pond can be used for watering during dry periods, a closed cycle, just like on Earth. Only here, he was the first to come up with it. Meanwhile, the forest fruit sprouts had survived the rain. What's more, they had grown. Over the course of a week of rain, the stems had stretched out to the length of a whole palm. The leaves had unfurled, broad and fleshy, dark green with reddish veins. Ethan examined them every day, measuring their growth with notches on a stake nearby. 3 fingers a day. That was impossible even by the standards of the fastest-growing earth crops. Bamboo grows 1 finger a day and is considered a record breaker. These plants were growing 3 times faster. Magic. Or what they called magic here. For Ethan, it was biology on steroids. Accelerated metabolism, enhanced photosynthesis, soil saturated with something that forced the roots to draw nutrients at a rate earth plants could only dream of. He shared his thoughts with Juna. She listened and said that the forest had always been this way, that her father had said the wild forest lived faster than the human world, that the trees in the forest grow to the size it takes an ordinary tree 100 years to reach in just 10, that the animals in the forest are larger, stronger, and smarter, and that the water in the blue stream makes this happen even faster. Ethan asked where this power came from. Juna didn't know. Her father didn't know. No one knew. The forest simply was that way, always. Ethan thought that someone at some point had known, and that this someone had left an iron plow with English letters somewhere deep in the forest. But he didn't dwell on that. Not yet, anyway. In the middle of the 3rd month, something happened that changed everything. At dawn, Juna woke Ethan up. She was shaking him by the shoulder, and her face was set in a stern expression. She said one word: beast. Ethan stepped out of the barn. A beast stood in the field. Not red, not gray, another one. Huge, the size of a horse. No, bigger than a horse. Broad, heavy, with a head as massive as an anvil. 2 horns curving forward. Brown hide with dark spots. It looked like a bull or a bison, but larger than any bison Ethan had seen in his textbooks. The beast stood in the middle of the field, motionless. Its side was torn open. 3 deep gashes ran from its shoulder to its hip. Blood was flowing onto the ground, black, thick. The beast was trembling. Red and Gray sat by the greenhouse and watched. They didn't growl. They didn't move. They just watched. Juna said it was a forest ox, that they lived in herds deep in the wild woods, that this one was wounded. It had probably fought a predator and lost. She said it had come here to die, that wounded animals sometimes come to the edge of the forest, so a predator won't find the herd by following the trail of blood. Ethan looked at the ox, at the wounds, at the blood, at its trembling legs. The animal weighed at least a metric ton, maybe more. A single blow with its horn could kill a man. Mary stood behind him, holding her breath. Ethan walked toward the ox, slowly. 1 step, another step. His hands hanging at his sides, his head bowed, eyes down. No threat, no predator. A small, harmless man who smelled of earth and compost. The ox raised its head, looked at him. Its eyes were dark, deep. There was pain in them, and weariness, and something else, a question. Ethan stopped 3 steps away. He crouched down, made himself look smaller. He spoke, quietly, calmly, just as he used to speak to the sick cows on his father's farm. Nonsense. Rubbish. Words don't matter. It's the tone that matters. Steady, low, reassuring. The wolf listened. His ears turned toward Ethan. The trembling didn't stop, but it grew fainter. Ethan reached out his hand, not toward the muzzle, toward the shoulder, toward the healthy side. He touched it. The fur was hot. Fever. The infection had already set in. The ox flinched, but didn't kick, didn't run away. He stood there, trembling. Ethan turned to June. He said he needed water from the Blue Creek, a lot of it, as much as she could carry. June ran off. He turned to Mary. He said he needed rags, clean ones, and the bark decoction he'd been making for the little boy with the cough. Mary ran to the village. Ethan stayed with the ox, alone. He didn't move. He just sat there beside it, his hand on its healthy side. His voice was quiet, steady, an endless stream of words, none of which the ox understood. But the ox understood the tone. An hour later, Juna returned with 2 pots of blue water. Ethan took the first one. He washed the wounds. The ox flinched. It bellowed, a low sound that made the ground vibrate. Mary flinched. Ethan didn't move. He kept washing. Dirt, blood, chunks of hide. Beneath them, 3 deep cuts, down to the muscle, but not to the bone. That was good. The bone was intact, which meant the wolf could be saved. He poured the blue water over the wounds. He covered them with rags soaked in the decoction. It was impossible to tie such a massive carcass with rope. The rags simply lay there, pressed down by the beast's own weight when it finally lay down. Because it lay down. A massive forest wolf, weighing a metric ton, lay down in Ethan Marsh's field and closed its eyes. Juna stood and watched. She said quietly that she had never seen a forest wolf let a human get close to it. Never. Her father had tried. He'd been gored and walked around with a cracked rib for a week. Ethan replied that the secret was simple. You have to smell like someone who doesn't want to kill you. Juna looked at him with that same lingering gaze. Then she turned away. Ethan spent 3 days by the ox's side. He changed its bandages. He watered it with blue water. He fed it mimosa. The ox ate right out of his hands. Its huge, warm muzzle nuzzled his palms, and its soft lips took the leaves gently, just like a cow, just like the most ordinary cow on earth, only 5 times bigger. By the 4th day, the wounds had healed. Pink, young skin glistened where the torn gashes. The blue water was working, or the magic of this world was working, or both. The bull stood up. He shook his head. He looked down at Ethan. His head was level with an adult man's shoulder. His horns glistened in the morning light. He could have left. The forest was 100 paces away. His herd was waiting somewhere out there. The bull didn't leave. He lowered his head. He nudged Ethan in the chest with his nose, and stayed. Mary watched this from behind the fence, her lips trembling. She later told Ethan that at that moment she believed, not in his agronomy, not in his mushroom farm, not in his pipes, in him, that this man wasn't like everyone else. Ethan replied that he was just an ordinary guy. He just knew how to handle animals. Mary shook her head and went to cook dinner. He named the ox Thor because... By the end of the 3rd month, Ethan Marsh's field looked like this: 10 beds of vegetables and grains, 3 beds of wild berries that were growing like crazy, 5 shy mimosa bushes that were enriching the soil, a greenhouse with seedlings, 3 compost pits in various stages of maturity, a drainage system made of clay pipes, a makeshift pond, a fence around the perimeter, and an animal pen, red and gray, Tor. 3 wild rabbits that had taken up residence on their own, and which Ethan decided not to chase away, but on the contrary, to feed. Their droppings made excellent fertilizer. 4 people and 6 animals on the land they'd given him so he could die. The village watched, silently, with different expressions on their faces, some with interest, some with envy, some with fear. But no one said any more that the stranger wouldn't live to see spring, because the stranger didn't just survive, he began to thrive, and that frightened them more than any curse from the wild forest. The first harvest of wild berries came in the middle of the 4th month. Ethan picked the first berry from the patch and held it in his hands for a long time, red, heavy, warm to the touch, even in the cool morning air. He broke it open. The flesh was orange, juicy, that very scent. Tomato and mango and peach and something that didn't exist on Earth. He let Mary try it. She took a bite, chewed, she froze. Then she took another bite. Then she looked at Ethan, and her eyes grew very wide. She said it was the best thing she'd ever eaten in her life. Ethan nodded. 3 garden beds yielded 42 fruits. 42. From 3 tiny garden beds. In a regular field, that same area would have yielded a dozen small turnips. The forest fruits were 4 times more productive than any local crop, and they held power, that very power, warmth inside, scratches that heal, fatigue that recedes. Ethan didn't hand out the fruits right away. He thought, 42 fruits for 4 people is 10 per person, enough for a week. And then, no, he had to do it differently. He needed the people in the village to try these fruits. Not everyone, just those who needed them most, the children. He went to Mary and asked how many children were in the village. Mary counted, 14, aged 2 to 12. Ethan took 20 fruits. He set aside 10 for seeds. He gave 12 to Mary and asked her to take 1 to each child in the village, plus 2 for Ella, because Ella was still drinking his concoction and was still weaker than the other children. Mary took the fruits and left. She returned 2 hours later. Her face looked strange. She said the children had eaten them and were asking for more. At first, the mothers didn't want to take them because they were afraid. But when their children took the first bite and a blush appeared on their pale cheeks right before their eyes within a minute, the mothers fell silent. 3 women were crying. One asked where they came from. Mary told the truth. From the stranger's field, from the seeds of Dicalesia. The woman turned pale. Then she looked at her child, at the rosy cheeks she hadn't seen in 2 years, and said nothing. 3 days later, a delegation came to Ethan in the field. 4 women, all mothers. They stood by the fence and remained silent. Ethan approached. One of them spoke up. She said they wanted to help, that they didn't believe that anything from the forest was a sin, not after what they'd seen, that they were ready to work if he'd give them food. 4 women, 8 working hands. Ethan opened the gate. That's how the second phase began. Now there were 8 of them. Ethan, Mary, June, Brant in the evenings, and 4 new female workers. There was plenty of room in the field. The mycelium continued to spread. By the middle of the 4th month, half of the rocky plot had turned into arable land. Ethan assigned the work. Mary was in charge of the garden beds and storage. June was in charge of the forest and the animals. The 4 new women were in charge of weeding, watering, and harvesting. He taught them every day. This is how you weed. Don't pull it up by the root. Cut it off at the ground. The root will rot and become fertilizer. This is how you water. Not from above, but at the base of the plant. Water on the leaves causes sunburn and fungus. Here's how to harvest. Don't pull. Twist. The stem stays intact and produces a second crop. The women listened. They nodded. They did as they were told. They made mistakes. They tried again. After a week, 2 of them were working almost as skillfully as Mary. Ethan was impressed. These people weren't stupid. They were just untrained. There's a huge difference. Meanwhile, Thor turned out to be more useful than Ethan could have dreamed. The forest ox, weighing over a metric ton, was incredibly strong and incredibly obedient. Not like a domestic cow that's obedient out of stupidity, but like an intelligent animal that's obedient by choice. Thor followed Ethan across the field. He stood where he was told to stand. He walked where he was directed to go. On the 3rd day after his recovery, Ethan tried to harness him, not to a plow. There was no plow, but to a sled. 2 poles tied together with a rope and a sack of stones. Thor looked at the contraption. He looked at Ethan, and he pulled it, easily, like an empty cart. The sack of stones that 4 men had struggled to lift dragged behind him like a rag. Ethan watched and did the math. 1 horse could plow an acre a day. Thor could plow 5, maybe 10, if there were a plow. He went to Brant, told him what he needed. A plow, a real one, made from that moon iron he'd brought back from the forest. Brant listened. Then he was silent for a long time. Then he said that moon iron was used to make swords, not plows, that it was sacrilege, that no blacksmith in the kingdom would waste moon iron on a farming tool. Ethan replied that a sword feeds 1 man, a plow feeds 100. Brant looked at him, then he nodded and went into the smithy. The plow was ready 10 days later, black, shiny, with a blade that cut through the earth like butter. The moon iron didn't dull. It didn't rust. It didn't bend. It was the best plow in the history of Valemark, and it was worth more than the entire village of Hollowbrook. The first plowing with Thor. Ethan remembered that day for the rest of his life. The ox walked steadily. The plow sank into the ground a hand's breadth. Behind them lay a furrow, even, deep, perfect. In a single day, they plowed 8 acres. 8 acres in a day. Mary stood at the edge of the field, her hands pressed to her chest. The women stopped working and watched. Even June came out of the woods and stood at the edge, her mouth agape. 8 acres in 1 day. Back in the village, a single man with a horse would plow 1 acre in 2 days, and that was only if the soil was soft. Ethan stopped Thor. He patted him on the neck. The ox snorted and nudged his muzzle into Ethan's pocket. Ethan pulled out a handful of nuts and fed them to him. Then he turned to the others. He said that tomorrow they would plant everything they'd plowed, that in 3 months there would be enough food here to feed 40 people, that in half a year, 100, and that he needed more hands. Mary said she knew people, in the village and beyond, people who had nothing to eat, whom no one would hire, widows, old people, the disabled, those whom everyone considers a burden. Ethan said that was exactly the kind of people he needed. Mary left. 3 days later, she brought a family, a 1-armed man, his wife, 2 children. The man's name was Olven. He'd lost his arm 2 years ago. An axe had slipped from the tree. A traditional healer had stopped the bleeding, but couldn't save his arm. Since then, Olven hadn't been able to work in the fields. No farmer would hire a 1-armed man. His family lived on charity and scraps. The children were skinny. His wife was haggard with exhaustion. Ethan looked at Olven, at his 1 arm, strong, veiny, calloused, a working arm. He asked Olven if he knew how to count. Olven said yes, up to 100. Ethan said he needed someone to keep track of the supplies, to count the sacks, to record how much was planted and how much was harvested. 1 hand was enough for that. Olven looked at him. His chin was trembling. He said he didn't know how to write. Ethan said he'd teach him. Olven closed his eyes, opened them, nodded. His wife turned away and covered her face with her hands. The children stared at Thor with their mouths agape. Ethan gave each of them a piece of fruit. 5 minutes later, their cheeks were rosy. And so Hollowbrook ceased to be a 1-man farm and began to become something else. Something for which Ethan had no word in the local language. In his native language, it was called a cooperative. The 5th month, Ethan's first real fall in this world. The leaves in the villages of Dicolacia didn't turn yellow. They darkened. They turned almost black and began to glow, a dim green light visible at sunset. The forest became beautiful, frightening, and even more alive than in the summer. In the village fields, the farmers were harvesting. A poor harvest, worse than last year's. Ethan stood by the fence and looked out at their fields. Thin, pale stalks, small grains, ears of wheat half empty. He knew that after this harvest, some of them wouldn't survive the winter. He also knew he couldn't feed the whole village, for now. His own harvest was different. The wheat in his garden bed stood thick and heavy. The kernels were large, with a golden sheen that the local wheat lacked. The turnips had grown to the size of 2 fists. Spinach covered 3 garden beds like a solid green carpet. The forest fruits were producing a second crop on the same stalks. The mimosa had spread, and its bushes now stood in every 4th row like living fertilizer factories. Ethan harvested the crop in 2 days. Everyone worked. Mary oversaw storage. June hauled the sacks. 4 women were sorting and grading the crop. Alwyn was counting. His wife, Beth, was feeding the workers. The children were running between the rows, gathering fallen ears of grain. Even Thor was working. He was pulling a handcart loaded with sacks from the field to the barn. The barn. It was a new building, small, log-built, constructed in 3 weeks by the entire team. Ethan designed it himself. A raised floor on stone supports, ventilation through slits under the roof. It's dry inside. No mold, no moisture. Grain stored in a barn like this lasts twice as long as in a village barn. The harvest total, 400 measures of wheat from 8 acres. The village fields yielded 100 measures from the same 8 acres, 4 times as much. That was impossible by local standards. Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. In a year, when the crop rotation was in full swing, the yield would be 6 times greater. In 2 years, 8 times as much. But even now, he had enough to feed 15 people all winter long, with plenty to spare. He sat down that evening with Mary and Olvin and did the math. 15 mouths to feed, 400 measures of grain, plus vegetables, plus mushrooms and nuts from the forest, plus meat. Red and Gray brought in rabbits regularly. June hunted, fish from the stream. Enough, with plenty to spare. But Ethan was looking further ahead. He went to the village elder. He proposed a deal. He would give the village 50 measures of grain, for free, no strings attached. The elder looked at him suspiciously. He asked why. Ethan said it was because the winter would be harsh, and people would die of starvation if he didn't help them. The village elder said that in Hollowbrook, people had been dying of starvation every winter for the past 10 years, and that this was normal. Ethan said that wasn't normal, that no one should die of hunger on land that could feed them. The village head remained silent. Then he took the grain, 50 measures. Ethan gave them away without regret. 50 measures is the survival of 5 elderly people until spring, or 3 children, or 1 family. Each measure is someone's breakfast. Every breakfast is 1 extra day. Every day is a chance that spring will come before the famine. The village accepted the grain and fell silent. They didn't thank him. They didn't scold him. It fell silent. That was good. Silence meant they were thinking. Meanwhile, Ethan set about the task he'd been putting off for 2 months. The clinic, or what was supposed to become the clinic. Juna found a spot in the forest where 7 types of medicinal plants grew. Ethan took notes. The bark of the silver tree stops a cough. The leaves of the blue moss reduce fever. The sap from the root with red veins heals wounds faster than blue water. Mimosa provides iron. Berries from the thorny bush relieve pain. 2 types of mushrooms, one for an upset stomach, the other for insomnia. 7 types, 7 remedies, all from the forest, all forbidden, all effective. Ethan began growing them on a separate plot in the far corner of the field, behind the mimosa bushes, out of sight. He didn't want any extra attention until he was ready, but attention came on its own. At the end of the 5th month, a woman arrived in Hollowbrook, not from the village, from far away. She'd been traveling for a week, thin, exhausted, wearing a nun's habit faded by the sun and rain. Her name was Hei-in Choi, Hei-in, a former nun and healer. She was on her way to Hollowbrook because she'd heard a story about a man who heals people with herbs from the wild woods. She'd heard this story from a merchant on the road. The merchant had heard it from a cart driver, the cart driver from a soldier, the soldier from a farmer in a neighboring village. Rumors traveled faster than Hei-in's feet, but her feet had carried her there. Hei-in stood at the gate to the field and looked at the garden beds, at the animals, at the people, at Thor, who was chewing mimosa in the corner of the field and was as big as a small house. Ethan approached. She spoke, quietly. Her voice was like that of someone who was used to speaking in a whisper because there were always sick people around. She said she had been a healer at the Silver Bowl Monastery, that she healed with herbs and prayers, that a year ago a boy had been brought to her, 5 years old, dying of a fever. She knew that the bark of a tree from the edge of the forest could save him. She asked the abbess for permission to use the cursed herb. The abbess forbade it. She said that if God wanted to take the boy, then so be it. Hei-in left at night. She found the bark. She brewed it. She gave it to the boy to drink. The boy survived. The Mother Superior expelled Hane from the convent. She declared her a heretic. Since then, Hane has been on the road, without a home, without money, without her order, with hands that knew how to heal, and with a faith that remained, but which her own church had called a sin. Ethan listened. Then he was silent. Then he said one thing. He said that Hane's God was probably tired of people using his name to forbid saving others, and that he thought God was glad that Hane was here. Hane stood there, motionless. Her lips were pressed together. Her eyes glistened. She was silent for a very long time. Then she nodded once and walked through the gate. From that day on, Hane became the 16th resident of Ethan's farm. No, not a farm, a settlement, because a farm is land and crops, but what Ethan had built was more than that. Hane claimed a corner of the barn, and in 3 days turned it into a clinic. Small, clean, with shelves for herbs, with a cot for the sick, with the scent of chamomile and bark that lingered there constantly. Ethan gave her the medicinal garden, all 7 varieties. Hane looked at the garden beds. She looked at the plants. Then she looked at Ethan and smiled for the first time. The smile was small and weary, but genuine. She said that in just a few months, he had grown what she had been trying to find her whole life. Ethan replied that growing them was easy. The hard part was finding someone who knew what to do with them. Hane began treating patients. First came a woman from the village with a toothache. Hane gave her a decoction to ease the pain. She didn't pull the tooth because it turned out not to be decayed, but simply inflamed. 2 days later, the pain was gone. Then came a man with a cut that hadn't healed for 3 weeks. Hane rinsed the wound with blue water and applied a bandage with forest moss. 4 days later, the cut had closed. Then a child with a fever. Then an old man with joint pain. Then a woman who hadn't been able to get pregnant for 3 years. Hane worked in silence. No fuss, no unnecessary words. She prayed before each treatment, and Ethan never interrupted her prayers, even when he didn't believe in them himself. He could see that for Hane, prayer wasn't a ritual, but part of the process. A way to focus, to calm the patient, to get herself in the right frame of mind. He respected that. By the end of the 5th month, Hane's clinic had treated 22 patients. Not a single one died. Not a single one got worse. 22 people from the village and the surrounding area who had come to the former nun in the heretic's field and left in good health. Rumors spread faster than Ethan would have liked, but he couldn't stop them, nor did he want to. Every person cured was a voice. When the time came and someone asked these people who Ethan Marsh was, they would answer, "He's the one who saved my child, my husband, my mother." That was stronger than any law, stronger than any seal, stronger than any ecclesiastical court. Winter came early. At the beginning of the 6th month, the first snow fell on the fields of Hollowbrook in a thin white layer. By morning, it had melted, but the warning was clear. Ethan gathered everyone, 17 people, Alwyn and her family, Mary, June, Hane, 4 women with children. Brant came too, even though he didn't technically live on the farm. Gareth hobbled over on a cane. Ethan spoke. Briefly, point by point. Winter would be harsh. There would be enough food, but no surplus. Firewood needed to be gathered now. The greenhouse needed to be insulated. The animals needed shelter. The people needed housing. The latter was a problem. 17 people couldn't spend the winter in the barn and the shed. They needed houses. Real ones. Warm ones. Ethan realized that it would be impossible to build real houses in the weeks remaining before the real cold set in. But they could build dugouts. He'd seen how they were built on prairie farms in the 19th century. His great-grandfather had built one when the Marsh family first arrived in Iowa. A hole in the ground. Walls made of sod and logs. A roof of poles covered with dirt and straw. Not pretty, not comfortable, but it's warm. The earth retains heat better than any wood. They started digging. Everyone, even the children, carried dirt in buckets. Tor hauled logs from the forest. June chose which trees could be cut down. She explained to Ethan that there are trees the forest gives up. Old ones, sick ones, fallen ones. Those can be taken. You mustn't touch the living, young, healthy ones. The forest will remember. Ethan understood. He'd done the same back home. He didn't cut down healthy trees in the forest strips. Only deadwood. Only windfall. Here, that rule had a different meaning. A literal one. The forest here remembered. 4 dugouts, each for 4 people, in 2 weeks. The work was hellish. Everyone's hands were bleeding. Their backs were stiff as boards, but the dugouts took shape. Ethan designed each one, the entrance on the leeward side, a chimney in the corner, beds raised 1/2 meter above the floor to keep out the cold. The walls were coated with clay on the inside to seal them. The floor was made of packed earth, covered with dry straw. Not exactly a palace, but in the winter, it would be 10 degrees above zero inside, even when it was 20 degrees below zero outside. Meanwhile, what Ethan had both expected and feared happened. A third family of refugees. They came from the village of Brackenmore, a 3-day journey away. A man, a woman, 3 children, the man's elderly mother, 6 people, hungry, ragged, the children with sunken eyes. The man's name was Damon. He was a carpenter, a good one, but the Lord of Brackenmore had raised the tithe to half the harvest, and the family couldn't make ends meet. They left at night, abandoning their home. They'd been walking for 3 days, according to what they'd heard, about a place where a stranger feeds the hungry and heals the sick and asks for nothing in return. Ethan looked at them. 6 people, plus 17, 23. There's enough food, just barely, but it's enough. There isn't enough shelter. He turned to Damon and asked if he could build. Damon looked at his hands, then at Ethan. He said that building was the only thing he knew how to do. Ethan said he needed a 5th dugout by tomorrow evening. Damon looked at the 4 that were already finished. He looked at his tools, he looked at Ethan, and he started digging. The 5th dugout was ready in a day and a half. It was better than the first 4, smoother, sturdier. Damon knew wood the way Ethan knew the earth. His joints were tight, his beams stood straight. Ethan watched Damon's work and realized he'd found the man he'd been looking for, a builder, because garden beds and crops are only half the battle. The other half is having roofs over our heads. After Damon's family had settled in, Ethan came to see him that evening. He sat down next to him by the fire. He laid out his plan. Not for a month, for a year. 20 houses, real ones, not dugouts, made of logs and stone, with stoves, with windows, with doors, an entire street, with a granary, with a clinic, with a workshop for Brant, with pens for the animals. Damon listened. His face was impassive. Then he asked how many people it would take. Ethan said 100. Damon looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he thought for a moment. Then he nodded. He said that if there was a forest and enough hands, it could be done. That he needed an assistant and tools. Ethan said there was wood. People would come. Brant would make the tools. Damon nodded again. And from that day on, he was no longer just a refugee. He was Hollowbrook's chief builder. Winter really bit down in the middle of the 6th month. Snow fell and didn't melt. The temperature dropped. A north wind blew right through the village. People were freezing in their houses. It was warm in Ethan's dugouts. He knew that. They found out too. 3 villagers came to take a look. They climbed into the dugout. They came out with their eyes wide open. One of them asked how it worked. Ethan explained. The earth retains heat. The pit must be at least 4 feet deep. The entrance is narrow. The chimney is angled. Simple rules. The man listened. He nodded. He went home. 2 days later, he started digging a hole next to his house. Not a dugout, but a cellar. A warm cellar based on Ethan's principle. A week later, 3 households in the village had warm cellars. Ethan didn't help. He didn't interfere. He simply answered questions when asked. He knew that was how it worked best. Don't give, show. People take it upon themselves when they see that it works. By the end of the 6th month, Ethan did something he hadn't dared to do before. He organized a celebration, the first in the history of his settlement. A harvest festival in reverse. Not when they harvested, but when they survived. The first half of winter. They nailed together tables from planks and set them up between the dugouts. Mary cooked for 3 days. Bread. Real bread made from wheat grown in Ethan's field. With butter. Butter made from forest nuts that Juna had gathered by the sackful. Braised meat. Vegetable stew. Sweet pies with wild berries. A hot brew of berries and herbs that Hayne brewed in a huge cauldron. Ethan invited the whole village, all 60 people. Not everyone came. 40 came. They sat down at the tables and ate. The children ate and couldn't stop. The elders ate in silence. One man took a piece of bread with butter and held it in his hands without taking a bite. He just held it there, stared at it. His wife touched his shoulder, and he flinched. Then he took a bite. Then he closed his eyes. Gareth sat at the end of the table and ate pumpkin puree, slowly, spoonful by spoonful. Tears streamed from his eyes, and he didn't wipe them away. Father Anselm came in. He stood to the side until Mary led him to the table and sat him down. He sat there and looked at the food, at the people, at the children with rosy cheeks, at the old people who were crying, at the animals lying by the fire, leaving everyone alone, at Ethan, who was walking between the tables, pouring hot broth. Anselm stood up. Everyone looked at him. He wanted to say grace. It was his job, his duty. He opened his mouth. He closed it, opened it again. He said he didn't know who had sent Ethan, but whoever had sent him, he thanked them for it. Ethan stopped. He looked at Anselm. He replied that no one had sent him, that he was just a farmer. Anselm nodded. He sat down and began to cry, quietly, into his hands folded on the table. No one said a word. Mary placed a piece of pie in front of him. He began to eat without looking up. That evening, the village of Hollowbrook ceased to be just a village, and Ethan's field ceased to be just a field. It became one thing, one place, one breath. There was a word for it, home. Winter showed no mercy. The second half was worse than the first. Blizzards, freezing temperatures. For 3 days in a row, the temperature dropped so low that the water in the stream froze over. Ethan checked the greenhouse every 4 hours, day and night. The glass cracked from the cold. He sealed the cracks with resin and clay. The seedlings inside survived, but barely. Thor stood in the pen that Ethan and Damon had built out of logs and earthen walls. The ox wasn't cold. His hide was thicker than that of any domestic animal, but he was bored. Ethan could tell by the way Thor stood by the pen's fence and stared at the forest for a long time, motionless. He surely remembered his home. Ethan came to see him every evening. He brought mimosa. He scratched him behind the ear. He spoke to him in English because Thor didn't understand any language anyway, and Ethan didn't care which one he didn't understand. Red and Gray spent the winter in Juna's dugout. She let them in, and they slept curled up in a ball by the fire. Juna slept between them. Mary said it was improper. Juna didn't answer. Meanwhile, in the middle of winter, what Ethan had warned about happened. The first visit from Lord Trevane, not the Lord himself, an inspector, a man named Horace, skinny, with shifty eyes. With papers and an inkwell, he arrived on horseback in the morning and stood at the gate to the field until Ethan came out. Horace announced that he had come on an inspection on behalf of Lord Cassius Trevane, that he needed to survey the land, assess the harvest, and determine the amount of the tithe. Ethan let him in. Horace walked around the field. He looked at the garden beds, at the barn, at the animals. His face was stony, but his eyes darted about. He was counting. Ethan could see him counting, assessing, figuring out how much he could take. Horace stopped by the granary. He asked Ethan to open it. Ethan opened it. Horace saw the sacks. His eyes widened. He hadn't expected so much. No one had expected so much from 30 acres of rock. He took notes. He wrote down a lot. Then he approached Ethan and said that the tithe on the heretic's harvest had been doubled by a decision of the church council, that Ethan must give not a tenth, but a fifth, and that if he did not pay by spring, his land would be confiscated. Ethan looked at Horace, calmly. Then he asked on what grounds the tithe had been doubled. Horace said it was based on a decision by the church council. Ethan asked if Horace had a copy of this decision. Horace hesitated. He said no, that the decision was verbal. Ethan said that without a written document bearing a seal, he would not recognize any changes to the tithe amount, and that he would pay exactly 1/10 as required by the law on land allotments. Horace opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He wasn't used to peasants knowing the law. He turned around and rode off. Ethan watched him go and counted the days. Horace would reach Trevane Castle in 2 days. He'd report what he'd seen. Cassius would think it over. He'd make a decision. He'd send someone, or he'd come himself. Ethan turned and walked over to Mary. He told her they needed a wall, a real one, around the entire settlement. Mary asked why. Ethan said it was because in the spring, people would come who would want to take everything they'd built, and that the wall was the first answer to that problem. They began building the wall in the middle of winter. Madness. But Ethan knew it would be too late by spring. Damon took charge of the design. A palisade, a double row of stakes with earth between them, 2 men tall, a gate with a bolt, lookout posts at the corners. Not a fortress, but enough to keep a dozen soldiers from storming in. The forest provided the materials. Juna picked out the trees. Only dead ones, only fallen ones. Thor hauled them. Brant hewn them. Damon set them in place. Everyone else helped. The children packed the earth between the rows of stakes. The women filled the gaps with clay. Olwen counted the logs and kept track. The wall grew, slowly. It's hard to work in the freezing cold. Your hands go numb. The wood won't bend. The ground is frozen. But the wall grew. By the end of winter, it encircled 3/4 of the settlement. A section on the forest side remained. Ethan had left it open on purpose. He said the forest wasn't the enemy, that a wall against the forest wasn't necessary. Damon looked at him as if he were crazy, but he didn't argue. Meanwhile, Ethan was working on another project. At night, when everyone was asleep, he sat in a dugout by the light of an oil lamp and drew maps, diagrams, plans, not fields, a village, a future village, streets, houses, a town square, a well in the center, a school, a clinic, a blacksmith shop, barns, pens, workshops. He was drawing a city, not a village, a city, on the 30 acres they'd given him so he'd die. He showed the plans to Mary. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked up and asked how he knew how to build a city. Ethan said that back home he'd been a teacher, that he'd taught people how to make the land provide for them, and that a city is just a big farm where people take the place of garden beds. Mary shook her head. She said he was a strange man. It was the 3rd time someone had told him that. Ethan was starting to get used to it. In the last week of winter, something happened that Ethan would have recorded in a textbook if he'd had one. The mimosa seeds he'd planted in every fourth row produced an unexpected result. The soil around the mimosa bushes became different, not just richer in nitrogen, but different. It began to glow, faintly, barely noticeable, a greenish shimmer visible only at night. Ethan stepped out into the darkness and saw his garden beds. The strips of mimosa were glowing. So was the soil between them, with a dim but clear light. He crouched down, took a handful, rubbed it between his fingers, sniffed it. The soil smelled like a forest, not his field, but a forest, a wild forest. The mycelium he'd brought back from the forest, the mimosa that fixed not only nitrogen, but something else as well, the blue water he'd used to water it. All of this together had turned his field into a piece of the wild forest. Small, manageable, tamed, but real. The magic of the forest was no longer beyond the fence. It was here, on his land, in his soil. He stood in the darkness, staring at the glowing earth, and his hands were shaking, because he understood. This wasn't just farming, it was more, much more. He wasn't just growing a crop, he was giving back to the world what had been taken from it 1,000 years ago. Someone had taken it, someone with earthly knowledge, someone who had come from Ohio in the year 1847. Ethan stood in the darkness above the glowing earth and thought of the iron plow deep in the forest, of the man who had come here before him, about what that man had built, and about how he, Ethan Marsh, was slowly and unwittingly destroying it. Spring arrived like an explosion. The snow melted in 3 days. The earth cracked open, and Ethan's field came to life so vividly that it took Mary's breath away. The glowing soil was at work. The seeds Ethan had planted in the fall sprouted all at once. The entire field was covered with a green carpet in just 1 week. Wheat, spinach, turnips, wild berries, mimosa, all together, all at once. The garden beds looked like a piece of the wild forest that had sprung up in the middle of the farmlands. Vibrant, lush, unconventional by local standards, but alive. So alive that even the villagers would stop at the fence and watch in silence. Ethan didn't celebrate. He knew that spring would bring more than just a harvest. It would bring Cassius, and he was right. In the middle of the first week of spring, a horseman arrived in the village. Not Horace, another one, a young man, in chainmail, with a sword at his belt, a soldier. He dismounted in the square by the church and announced that Lord Cassius Trevane would arrive in 7 days to inspect his lands, that all residents were required to prepare their tithes, that special attention would be paid to the plot on the edge of the wildwood, belonging to the heretic Ethan Marsh. The soldier rode off. The village buzzed with talk. Ethan stood at his gate and counted. 7 days. Not much time, but there was still time to do something. He gathered his men, 23 men, plus Brant, plus Gareth, 25. He said Cassius would come, that he wouldn't come alone, that there would be soldiers, and that their task wasn't to fight, but to show that this isn't heresy, this is life. Mary asked how to show that to someone who doesn't want to see. Ethan replied that it wasn't for Cassius. Cassius wouldn't change his mind, but there would be people with him, soldiers, officials, maybe priests, and they would see. Children with rosy cheeks, full granaries, healthy animals, walls, houses, the infirmary, order, and they'll return to their homes and tell others. Rumors are a weapon that works both ways. 7 days. Ethan worked. Everyone worked. Mary cleaned the granary until it sparkled. Hayne arranged the herbs and medicines on the shelves so that everyone who entered could see them. Damon finished the last section of the wall. Olwen counted all the supplies and made a list, in crooked letters, but a list nonetheless. Juna did something else. She went into the forest and returned 2 days later. 4 animals came with her. 2 red foxes like Red, a she-wolf, and another forest wolf, a young one, smaller than Thor, but still enormous. They came for her, as if she were one of their own. Ethan watched this and realized what he'd suspected for a long time. Juna didn't just know the forest knew her, recognized her, just as it had recognized I, only earlier, since childhood. Now there were 11 animals living in the clearing. Thor and the young wolf, Red and Gray, and the 2 new foxes, the she-wolf and the rabbits, which he had long since stopped counting. It was a herd, small, a motley crew, but a herd. And it obeyed. Not the way domestic animals obey their owner, the way a pack obeys its leader. Ethan wasn't the leader, Juna was. Or perhaps they both were. He couldn't say for sure. On the 5th day before Cassius's arrival, another event took place. A woman approached the gate, a young woman, dressed for travel, but her clothes were different. Not peasants, not a nun's. Expensive fabric, fine workmanship. Even dirty and torn from the journey, these clothes spoke of money and status. The woman's name was Abigail Trevane Winthrop. Ethan heard the surname and his back tensed. Trevane. Abigail saw his reaction and said she wasn't a spy, that she was a distant relative of Cassius, a second cousin, that she had fled the capital because she'd broken off her engagement to the man her clan had chosen for her, that she'd been exiled to the countryside, that she'd heard about Hollowbrook, about the stranger, about the forest, and she'd come because she had nowhere else to go. Ethan looked at her. Expensive clothes, a straight back, a gaze that looks down on you slightly, even when you're a head taller, an aristocrat, in every gesture, in every word. He asked her what she could do. Abigail listed them off. Law, 3 languages, correspondence, accounting, the history of the kingdom, land laws, trade regulations, tax codes. Ethan listened, and his heart was pounding, not from nervousness, from good fortune. What he'd been missing most of all had fallen into his hands. A lawyer, someone who knew the system from the inside, someone who could read the laws in a language Ethan hadn't yet fully mastered, someone who could draft a document that wouldn't fall apart in court. He told Abigail she needed a room, ink, paper, and a copy of the land allotment law. Abigail raised an eyebrow. Then she smiled for the first time. The smile was subtle, sharp, like a knife. She said she had 3 scrolls with her: the Land Allotment Act, the Church Statute on Tainted Gifts, and the Trevane County Land Code. She'd brought them from the capital, just in case. Ethan laughed. For the first time in a long while, genuinely, Abigail had worked for 2 days straight without sleep. She had been reading the laws, taking notes, drafting arguments. Her handwriting was small and neat, like block letters. Ethan sat beside her and listened. Abigail explained. The Land Allotment Act was enacted by the Crown, not by a lord, not by the church, by the Crown. Only a royal steward, by decision of a royal court, can seize a fief. A lord may increase the tithe, but not by more than 1/5. The church may declare someone a heretic, but cannot confiscate land. These are different jurisdictions: ecclesiastical authority and secular authority. They overlap, but do not coincide. Cassius is using an ecclesiastical charge to justify a secular confiscation, but legally, this is unlawful. Without a ruling from the royal court, he has no right to do so. Ethan asked what was required for the royal court. Abigail said an appeal must be filed through the county steward formally, with a seal, with witnesses' signatures, with a description of the property, with proof that the land is being used for its intended purpose. Ethan asked how much time an appeal would buy them. Abigail said that by law, the review takes 6 months. 6 months during which the land cannot be confiscated. 6 months. Half a year, an entire season. Ethan looked at Abigail. She looked at him. Then she said he was the first farmer she'd ever met who needed a lawyer instead of a sword. Ethan said that a sword solves the problem for just 1 day. A piece of paper lasts a generation. The law lasts forever. Abigail looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. On the 7th day, Cassius Trevane arrived. Cassius Trevane arrived with 30 soldiers, on horseback, in full armor, chainmail, swords, shields, spears. 30 war horses kicked up dust on the village road. Ethan stood at the gate of his wall and watched. Standing nearby were Mary, June, and Abigail, Brant with a hammer on his shoulder, and Damon with an axe. Behind the wall stood the rest, the women, the children, Olwen, Hain, Gareth on his cane. Thor stood behind the gate, his horns visible above the palisade. Cassius dismounted at the gate. Ethan saw him for the first time. Tall, lean, dark hair with early gray at the temples. His face was not malicious, intelligent, cold. His eyes were gray and attentive. This man was no fool, nor was he a monster. He was the master, and he had come for his property. Cassius stopped 3 paces from Ethan. He looked at the wall, at the beasts beyond it, at the people, at the garden beds visible through the open gate, at the green overgrowth that shouldn't be here, at the ground that glowed at night, something he'd surely already been told about. He said he was amazed, without irony. He said he hadn't expected to see anything here but bones and desolation, and that now he saw something far more dangerous than a dead vagrant. He sees a precedent. Ethan remained silent. Cassius continued. He said that Ethan had built something interesting, but that this something disrupts the order. That a commoner cannot own beasts from the wildwood, cannot grow tainted crops, cannot take in refugees without the Lord's permission, cannot build walls without royal permission. That each of these points taken individually constitutes a violation, and taken together, it is rebellion. Ethan waited for Cassius to finish. Then he turned to Abigail. Abigail stepped forward. She took out a scroll, unrolled it, and began to read. An appeal to the royal court, drafted according to form, bearing Ethan's seal, which Brant had carved from moon iron, signed by 23 witnesses, including a description of the property, stating that the land is being used for its intended purpose this in accordance with the Land Allotment Act, with a separate clause stating that a church accusation of heresy is not grounds for secular confiscation under Section 17 of the Land Code. Cassius listened. His face remained unchanged, but his eyes had changed. He looked at Abigail. He recognized her. His lips tightened. He said her name. Abigail. She replied, "Uncle, not uncle, cousin." But that's exactly what she said. Uncle, with a smile that was colder than his gaze. Cassius was silent for 10 heartbeats. Ethan counted. Then Cassius said that an appeal wouldn't change anything, that the court in the capital would rule in his favor, that he had connections and money and the law on his side, that in 6 months he'd return with a royal decree, and then there would be no walls, no beasts, no refugees, and no glowing garden beds. Ethan replied. He said that in 6 months there would be not 25 people here, but 100, not 30 acres, but 100, not 1 sanatorium, but 3, and that each of these people would know their name and their rights, and that Cassius could bring an army, but an army wouldn't plow the field or bring in the harvest. These people, however, could. Cassius stared at him for a long time. Then he turned to his soldiers, and Ethan saw what he'd been afraid of. Cassius wasn't going to wait 6 months. He raised his hand. The soldiers moved toward the gate. Ethan didn't move. Mary behind him grabbed his sleeve. He shook his head. Thor took a step forward, just one. His head rose above the palisade. His horns glinted in the sun. The boar let out a sound, low, deep. The ground trembled. The soldiers' horses stopped. 2 backed away. 1 reared up. The rider barely managed to stay in the saddle. Thor took another step. Behind him, a she-wolf emerged from behind the wall. Red and gray came out on either side. 2 new foxes stood behind them. A young wolf emerged last. 11 animals. Each one was looking at the soldiers. They weren't growling. They weren't baring their teeth. They were just looking. The horses were nervous. 3 soldiers turned pale. 1 dropped his spear. Cassius raised his hand again. The soldiers stopped. He turned to Ethan. His face was stony. He said it was a threat. Ethan replied that it wasn't, that the animals wouldn't attack unless approached, that it wasn't a threat, it was a family, and that a family defends itself when people come at it with swords. Cassius was silent. Abigail approached him and held out a scroll, a copy of the appeal, for his records. Cassius took it without looking. Then he spoke quietly so that only Ethan and Abigail could hear. He said that Ethan didn't understand what he had unleashed, that this wasn't about the land or the tithe. That when the common folk saw that a single man could stand up to a lord and remain standing, every estate in the kingdom would turn into a fortress, and in 10 years there would be a war the world has ever seen. Ethan replied that if the only way to maintain order is to starve people, then perhaps order is worth changing. Cassius looked at him, and in his cold gray eyes, Ethan saw something unexpected. Not anger, not hatred, recognition. Cassius turned away. He mounted his horse. He led the soldiers away. But Ethan knew this wasn't the end. It was a pause. 6 months, and Cassius would return with an army. Over the next few months, Hollowbrook changed so much that even Ethan sometimes didn't recognize it. People came from neighboring villages, from far away, families, lone travelers, the elderly, the disabled, those who had been denied food, medical care, and a place to belong. They had heard the news and came. By early summer, 40 families were living in the field. Damon was building like a man possessed. Houses sprang up along the street Ethan had laid out that winter. Real houses, made of logs and stone, with stoves that Brant built according to Ethan's blueprints. The school opened at the start of summer. Mary taught the children to read. 22 children. Every morning they sat on benches in the longhouse and traced letters on clay tablets. Mary had taught herself to write over the winter. Olwen helped her. The one-armed bookkeeper, who a year ago didn't know a single letter, now wrote better than half the village. Hayne expanded the clinic. A second building, 4 cots, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with jars and pouches of herbs. She was training 2 women who wanted to become healers. She taught them to identify plants, to prepare decoctions, how to clean wounds. It was the first medical training in Hollowbrook's history. Sun Hee Park arrived in the middle of summer. A merchant's daughter, 22 years old, quick-witted, sharp, with a tongue that cut like a razor. Her father had died on the road 2 months earlier, and she was left alone with a bundle of goods and knowledge of 3 languages. She hadn't come for food, she'd come on business. Ethan realized this at first glance. He handed the trade over to her, all of it, purchasing, sales, trade with neighboring villages. Sun Hee looked at him suspiciously. Then she took in the scope of what was being offered to her. Then her eyes lit up. Within a week, she had established trade with 3 villages, Forest fruits and medicines from Hollowbrook were exchanged for cloth, metal, and salt. A month later, Hollowbrook had a trading network, small but functioning. Ethan made Sun-Hee a seal with her name on it, her very own, a trade seal. Sun-Hee took the seal and held it in her hands for a long time. That evening, Mary found her behind the barn. She was sitting on the ground, crying, clutching the seal to her chest. Mary sat down beside her. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. Cassandra Reed showed up in Hollowbrook at the end of summer. Or rather, she was dragged there. Juna found her in the woods, 200 paces from the edge. The woman was lying under a tree, unconscious, with a shattered knee and empty scabbards on her belt. The sword lay nearby, a good sword, an expensive one, a mercenary's sword. Juna called Ethan. They brought her to the infirmary. Haim examined her knee. She shook her head. She said the bone was shattered into 3 pieces, that without blue water, the leg couldn't be saved, and that even with the water, she'd limp for the rest of her life. Ethan brought the water. Hain worked. For 3 days. She changed the bandages. She gave her herbal teas. She poured the blue water directly into the wound. Cass would come to, and then drift off again. She was delirious. She called out someone's name. She cursed. She gritted her teeth. On the 4th day, she opened her eyes. Clear, cold, gray. She looked at the ceiling, at the walls, at Hain, who was sitting nearby. She asked where she was. Hain said she was in Hollowbrook. Cass closed her eyes. Then she opened them. She asked quietly, "Is this the same Hollowbrook?" Hain nodded. Cass laughed, hoarsely, painfully. She said she'd come to burn it down, that Lord Trevane had paid her 20 silver pieces for the farmer's head by the forest, that she'd walked through the wild woods to approach from the rear, and that in the forest, something she couldn't see had attacked her. Fast, heavy, it struck her knee and vanished. She didn't even have time to swing her arm. Ethan stood in the doorway, listening. Cass turned her head toward him. She looked at him. He didn't look like a man worth 20 pieces of silver. Skinny, dirty, with dirt under his fingernails, with a face more suited to a country schoolteacher than a rebel. She asked why he'd saved her. Ethan said she was wounded. That was reason enough. Cass was silent for a long time. Then she said he was a strange man. For the 4th time. Ethan was definitely used to it. Cass's knee had healed in 2 weeks. The blue water had worked, but Hain was right. The limp remained, slight but noticeable. For a mercenary whose life depended on the speed of her feet, it was a death sentence. Cass sat on a bench by the infirmary and sharpened her sword, day after day, in silence. Ethan approached her on the 15th day. He sat down next to her. He was silent. Then he said he needed someone who understood how violence works, not to use it, but to defend against it. Cass looked at him. He said that in 4 months, Lord Trevane would return with an army, that there were 40 families in Hollowbrook, women, children, the elderly, people who don't know how to wield a sword, that he needed someone who would turn them not into soldiers, but into defenders. Cass asked what the difference was. Ethan said that a soldier kills on command. A defender stands his ground because someone is sleeping behind him. Cass looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was a strange man, Marsh, and that she was staying, not for the money, for food and a roof over her head, and because, with her lame leg, she had nowhere else to go anyway. Ethan nodded. He didn't say that he knew the real reason. Cass began training people, 8 men and 2 women, every morning, with sticks because there were no swords. With the basics, she hammered into them like nails. Stance, breathing, movement, not pretty, not flashy, functional, but most importantly, she turned them into beasts. Juna brought red and gray to her. Cass looked at them and understood instantly. These weren't pets. They were weapons. Fast, smart, loyal. She began training the humans and the beasts together. A pair. A human and a beast. The human provides cover. The beast attacks. The human distracts. The beast comes in from the side. Juna helped. She spoke a language that didn't exist. The language of the body, of gestures, sounds. The beasts obeyed her just as a pack obeys its leader. Cass watched and shook her head. She told Ethan that Juna alone, with 10 beasts, was worth a company of soldiers. Ethan replied that he knew, and that was exactly why Juna must never go to war. Because if the lords found out that the forest beasts obeyed humans, they would start capturing the beasts and breaking them, just as they break horses, just like they break dogs, and the wildwood won't forgive that. Cass looked at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, with respect. Fall was spent preparing. The wall grew taller. The gates grew stronger. Damon built 2 watchtowers. Brant forged spearheads, not from moon iron, from ordinary iron. The moon iron was used for tools, plows, shovels, kitchen knives, sickles, axes. Every tool made of lunar iron worked better than an ordinary one. It didn't dull. It didn't rust. It didn't break. Ethan understood that he was spending precious metal on everyday items, and he didn't regret it for a second, because a sword means one death. A plow means 100 lives. By the start of the second winter, Hollowbrook looked like this: a palisade around the perimeter, 22 houses inside, a school, a clinic, a blacksmith shop, 3 barns, pens for animals, Damon's workshop, Sunhee's trading post, a central square with a well, a street that Mary swept every morning, even though no one asked her to, 120 people, 30 of them were children, 10 fighters with 10 beasts, 1 blacksmith, 1 builder, 1 lawyer, 1 healer, 1 merchant, 1 tracker, 1 bookkeeper, and 1 farmer, who stood at the center of it all and sometimes couldn't believe he'd started with 30 acres of rock and a handful of sour soil in his mouth. Cassius arrived in the middle of the second winter, not with 30 soldiers, with 200 infantry, cavalry, 24 archers, and a supply train. He didn't come to inspect. He came to lay siege. Ethan found out about it 2 days later. Sunhee had set up a network of informants among the merchants on the roads. A cart driver who was hauling salt from the city saw the column and sent a boy to warn them. 2 days. Ethan called a council meeting. For the first time, all the key people were gathered around one table. Mary, Junna, Abigail, Cass, Sunhee, Hane, Brant, Damon, Olwen, Gareth, 10 people. Ethan said that 200 soldiers were not the same as 30, that the wall wouldn't withstand an assault, that 10 fighters against 200 was a hopeless battle. Cass confirmed this. She said that in an open assault, they'd hold out for a day, maybe 2. Then the wall would be breached and it would all be over. Abigail said the appeal was still pending, that Cassius was breaking the law by bringing an army before the court had reached a decision, that if they survived and filed a complaint with the capital, Cassius would lose his title. If they survived, Ethan thought. Everyone was silent. They waited. He looked at Junna. He asked one thing. Could the forest help? Junna was silent. Then she said that the forest isn't a weapon, that the forest isn't an army, that the forest lives on its own. But, she said but, and fell silent. Ethan waited. Junna said that the forest moves every year, 10 steps, 15. The edge is getting closer. She said that no one knows why, but she senses it. The forest is growing because people have stopped fearing it, because someone on this side of the edge has stopped cutting, burning, and cursing, because the mycelium has spread out from Ethan's field 300 paces in every direction, and the earth is changing, and the forest senses that the earth is becoming its own again. She said she couldn't command the forest, but she could ask. Ethan nodded. Cassius arrived at dawn on the 3rd day. 200 soldiers surrounded Hollowbrook on 3 sides. The 4th side was the forest. Cassius sat on his horse 100 paces from the gate. Standing beside him was a man in ecclesiastical vestments, tall, with a stern face. Not Anselm, not Corvin, someone higher up, the archpastor or his representative. The church and the Lord had joined forces. Cassius had sent a herald. The herald announced that Ethan Marsh was accused of heresy, rebellion, the illegal taming of the beasts of the wildwood, and refusal to pay the lawful tithe, that he was ordered to surrender his property, hand over the beasts, dismiss his men, and turn himself in to stand trial. Otherwise, Hollowbrook would be taken by force. Ethan stood on the watchtower and looked at the arrival of the soldiers. Cass stood beside him. She was counting, a mercenary's habit. Then she said quietly that they didn't stand a chance in open combat. Ethan replied that he had no intention of fighting. He climbed down from the watchtower. He entered the granary. There were sacks of grain, jars of medicinal brews, baskets of wild berries, everything they had grown and gathered over the course of a year. He picked up one sack, carried it out through the gate, set it on the ground in front of the wall, went back, carried out a second, a third, a fourth. Mary watched him. Then she understood and began to help. They laid out their entire harvest in front of Hollowbrook's wall, all their supplies, all their food, bags of grain, baskets of vegetables, jars of medicine, bundles of dried herbs, barrels of nuts, everything. Then Ethan stepped forward, alone, unarmed, without armor, in work clothes, with dirt on his knees. He stopped 50 paces from Cassius, and he spoke, loudly, so that all 200 soldiers could hear him. He said that there was food before them, that this food had been grown on land everyone had considered dead, that this food could feed 2 villages for the entire winter, that it was grown without magic, without sorcery, without curses, by hand, with knowledge, with patience. He said that among these soldiers there were surely those with hungry children at home, hungry wives, hungry mothers, and that every sack of grain they now saw could be theirs, on their table, in their home, if only they knew what he knew. He said he was no sorcerer, no heretic, no rebel. He's a farmer. He knows how to make the land yield 4 times as much. And he's ready to teach anyone who wants their family to eat their fill. For free, no strings attached. 200 soldiers were silent. Cassius was silent. The church official was silent. Then one soldier in the front row lowered his spear. He didn't thrust it into the ground. He simply lowered it. A second soldier did the same. A third, a fourth. Cassius saw this. His face froze. He raised his hand. He ordered the attack. The soldiers did not move. Not all of them. The front rank stood still. Those in the back exchanged glances. The officer to Cassius's right repeated the order. Silence. Cassius dismounted. He walked toward Ethan himself. He stopped 3 paces away. His face was white with rage. He said quietly that Ethan had bribed his army with a sack of grain. Ethan replied that he hadn't bribed them. I fed them. There's a difference. Cassius stared at him. Then he said something Ethan hadn't expected. He said he'd be back in a week with another army made up of people who didn't know hunger because they were nobles, and that then there would be no speeches, no grain, and no negotiations. Then he turned away. He mounted his horse. He led away those who were still willing to follow him, half of them. The other half remained standing there, 100 soldiers, standing before the walls of Hollowbrook and staring at the sacks of food. Ethan approached the one closest to him, a young man with a weather-beaten face and tired eyes. Ethan asked when he had last eaten his fill. The guy didn't answer. Ethan picked up a sack of grain. He held it out to him. The guy looked at the sack, at Ethan, at his comrades. He took it. By evening, 50 soldiers had gone home with the grain. 30 remained by the walls, not knowing where to go. Ethan opened the gate. 20 went in. 10 left at dawn. 20 remained. Cass looked at the 20 former soldiers sitting in Hollowbrook Square and told Ethan he was crazy. Then she said she needed a week to turn them into defenders, and she went off to work. That night, Ethan went outside the wall. He walked toward the forest. Alone. He stood at the edge. The forest rustled, as always, deeply, lively. But today the sound was different, closer, louder. Ethan looked down. The edge of the forest wasn't where he remembered it. It had shifted 30 paces in a single night. Trees stood where yesterday there had been a field, young, slender, with shimmering bark, grown in a matter of hours. The forest was moving. The forest had come. Ethan stood and looked at the trees that hadn't been there yesterday and felt the ground beneath his feet rumbling, quietly, deeply, like the heartbeat of something enormous. A week had passed. Cassius had not returned. Instead, news arrived. A messenger from the capital. A young man on an exhausted horse, carrying a letter bearing the royal seal. The letter was addressed to Lord Cassius Trevane, but the messenger did not find Cassius at his castle. The castle was empty. The servant said the lord had left for the south 2 days ago, alone, without soldiers, without an entourage. The messenger arrived in Hollowbrook because the letter mentioned that name. Abigail read the letter aloud. The royal court had considered Ethan Marsh's appeal out of turn. At the request of 3 junior nobles who traded with Hollowbrook through Sunhee, upon the recommendation of 2 alchemist guilds that had received samples of forest fruits and were ecstatic about their properties, based on the testimony of 14 soldiers who returned home with the grain and told their wives, and the wives told to their neighbors, and the neighbors told everyone, the court ruled, Ethan Marsh's land grant is confirmed. The church's charge of heresy is dismissed for lack of evidence. Lord Cassius Trevane is removed from the administration of the district for abuse of power. A commission was appointed to investigate land use practices in the settlement of Hollowbrook. Abigail finished reading and set the scroll down. The square was silent. 140 people stood in silence. Then Mary began to cry. Quietly, she pressed her hand to her mouth. Then Olwen, then the women, then the children, who didn't understand why everyone was crying, but cried along with the others. Gareth sat on his bench and didn't cry. He smiled, a toothless, old man smile. He said he'd live to see this day. Brant stood by the forge, his enormous hands hanging at his sides. He was silent. Then he turned and went into the forge. A minute later, the sound of a hammer striking came from inside. Steady, heavy. He was working. That was his way of finding joy. Hayne stood by the infirmary. Her hands were clasped as if in prayer. She was praying, quietly, with just her lips. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Ethan, and in her gaze was something he hadn't seen before. Peace. As if something inside her had finally fallen into place. Juna stood by the gate. Red sat at her feet. Gray lay nearby. The she-wolf stood a little farther away. Thor chewed on mimosa in the pen, and he didn't care. The animals didn't know what had happened. To them, the world hadn't changed. They were home. They had always been home. Soon he approached Ethan. She wasn't crying. She was thinking. She said that the commission from the capital was an opportunity. If they presented their case correctly, they could achieve not just protection for one settlement, but a change in the law for everyone. Ethan nodded. He knew. Abigail approached from the other side. She said they needed to prepare the documents, a complete description of the methods, harvest results, clinic records, and people's testimonies, everything that would prove Hollowbrook's practices could be replicated on any land at any forest edge in the kingdom. Ethan nodded again. Cass stood a little way off, sharpening her sword, as always. Ethan walked over to her. She didn't look up. He sat down beside her, silently. Then she said one word. Ethan. Not farmer, not marsh. Ethan. For the first time. He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the sword, but the corners of her lips twitched. It was a smile, her first. The commission arrived a month later. 3 officials, 2 alchemists, 1 priest, not the kind the Corvin send, another one, a young man, with curious eyes and questions that showed he truly wanted to understand, not to condemn. Ethan showed them everything. The fields, the garden beds, crop rotation, compost pits, drainage, the greenhouses, there were now 4 of them, the mushroom bed, mimosa, forest fruits, blue water, the infirmary, the school, the animals, the wall that turned out to be unnecessary. The alchemist stood before the garden beds with forest fruits and couldn't speak. One of them knelt, digging in the glowing soil, his hands trembling. The priest spoke at length with Hain, quietly, about faith, about herbs, about whether one is compatible with the other. Hain answered calmly. She showed her prayer beads next to the jars of forest medicines. She said that God gave people the earth and everything that grows on it, and that declaring part of his creation a sin is not faith. It is fear. The priest was silent. Then he nodded. The officials calculated. They took notes. They compared. Hollowbrook's harvest from 30 acres was equal to the harvest from 200 acres of ordinary farmland. The Hain Sanatorium admitted 180 patients that year. Not a single one died. At Mary's school, 34 children could read and count. Sunhee's sales turnover in half a year exceeded that of the county town's fair. They left a week later, their bags full of samples and records, with a promise that a report would be presented to the king. Ethan stood at the gate and watched them leave. Then he turned and walked out into the field. It was morning, early morning. Dew lay on the garden beds. The mimosa was unfurling its leaves toward the sun. Tor stood in the pen, chewing. Red sat by the greenhouse, licking his paw. Children's voices drifted over from the school. Mary was starting her lesson. It smelled like bread. Someone was baking. It must have been Beth, Olden's wife. She baked every morning. Ethan walked through his field, across land that had been rock 2 years ago, that had begun to glow a year ago, and that was now the most fertile soil in the kingdom. He walked, touching the plants, straightening the stakes, and checking the garden beds, with his hands, as always, just like every morning. At the edge of the field, right at the edge of the forest, he stopped. The forest stood right there, not 100 paces away, but 10. The young trees that had sprung up overnight when the forest arrived were already taller than a man. Their bark shimmered. The leaves rustled without a breeze. Something was moving among the trunks, not menacingly, intriguing. Ethan stood and looked into the forest. The forest looked back at him, and at that moment, he made a decision. He turned to June, who as always was standing somewhere nearby, silent as a shadow. He said he would go into the forest, deep inside, to a place he'd never been before, to where whatever it was he needed to find lay. Juna looked at him. She knew. She had always known. She nodded. That evening, Ethan gathered everyone together. He said he was leaving for 3 days, that Mary would be in charge while he was gone, that Cass was responsible for security, that Abigail would handle the paperwork, that Sunhee would hand trade, that Hain would look after the people. Mary asked where he was going. Ethan said to the forest, to find the answer to the question that had been tormenting him since day one, who had been here before him. Mary didn't try to talk him out of it. She knew it was useless. She put some bread in his bag, and a pie, and a flask of herbal tea, and a woolen scarf because it's cold in the woods. Ethan looked at the scarf. He looked at Mary. She turned away and walked toward the barn. He left at dawn, with June, with Red, with Gray, with the she-wolf, with 2 young foxes, 6 animals and 2 people, deep into the wild woods. They walked all day. The forest changed. The trees grew older, thicker, taller. The light changed, green, shimmering. The air grew thicker. The sounds changed. A hum, singing, whispers, voices that weren't there. June walked with confidence. She knew the way, not by a map, by something else. A feeling, a call. On the second day, they came to a river, wide, with blue water. That very same one, only here it was a river, not a stream. Warm, glowing, smelling of life. They crossed over the rocks. On the third day, Juna stopped. She stood at the edge of the clearing and didn't move. Ethan stepped up beside her, and he saw it. The clearing was round, 20 paces across. The grass in it was silvery. The trees around it stood in an even circle, like the columns of a temple. In the center of the clearing lay a stone, flat, gray, covered with moss. On the stone lay an iron plow, old, rusty, but unmistakably of this earth. Ethan walked over. He knelt down. He placed his hand on the handle. He ran his fingers over it. He found the letters, carved with a knife, deeply, clearly. T. Whitfield, Ohio, 1847. He closed his eyes. He opened them. He ran his finger over the letters once more. "Hello, colleague." He said it out loud. In English, for the first time in 2 years. "Hello, colleague. Will you tell me what happened here?" The wind in the clearing changed. It didn't pick up. It changed direction, as if the forest had sighed. The trees swayed. The moss on the rock began to glow, dimly, then brighter. Lines appeared on the rock beneath the plow. Not letters, drawings, maps, diagrams. Ethan watched. A man named T. Whitfield from Ohio came here in the year 1847. He saw a world full of magic that he feared. He saw beasts he didn't understand. He saw a power in the earth he couldn't control. And he did what any frightened man with earthly knowledge would do in a world without science. He built a system of control. He locked the magic away in the blood of noble families. He declared the forest cursed so that people wouldn't venture there. He created a church to guard the borders, and he went into the forest to die, alone, leaving behind the plow, like a note, like a warning, or like an invitation. Ethan knelt before the stone and understood. Whitfield wasn't evil. He was afraid. He saw the power and decided that people weren't ready for it. And maybe in 1847, he was right. But 1,000 years have passed. The world has changed. People had changed. The system he'd created had become a prison. Protection had become a cage, and someone had to open the door. Ethan stood up. He looked at June. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, crying, silently. Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She felt what the forest felt, relief. The forest had been waiting for 1,000 years, and someone had finally come. No fear, no chopping, no cursing, just understanding. Ethan walked over to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. They stood in the clearing at the heart of the wild forest. 2 people and 6 beasts. The forest rustled all around them. Not menacingly, not anxiously, like the sound a house makes when someone finally lives in it. Somewhere far beyond the trees, something very large turned its head in their direction. It didn't stand up. It didn't move. It just turned its head and looked, with interest, with warmth, with anticipation. Ethan felt that gaze. He didn't see it. He felt it, with his skin, with his bones, with the earth beneath his feet, and he wasn't afraid. He turned back, toward the house, toward the people, toward the fields, toward the children learning to read, toward the elderly eating their fill, toward the women tending to the sick, to the men who were building houses, to the animals that were no longer enemies, to everything he had built, with his hands, with his knowledge, with his patience. On the way back, Juno walked beside him, close, closer than usual. Red ran ahead. Gray brought up the rear. The she-wolf walked beside him. The pack, the family, the same word in the language of the forest. When they reached the edge of the forest and Ethan saw Hollowbrook, they were waiting for him. Everyone. Mary stood at the gate with a towel over her shoulder. Cass stood on the watchtower with a sword. Abigail sat on a bench with papers. Sunhi was counting sacks. Hayne was drying herbs. Olwen was taking notes. The children were running around. Thor was chewing. Smoke was rising from the chimneys. It smelled of bread and life. Ethan stopped. He looked at it all, at the village that 2 years ago had been 12 farmsteads and 60 hungry people, which was now home to 140, with full granaries, with a clinic, with a school, with a blacksmith shop, with trade, with walls, with people who knew their names and their rights, with a farmer who knew what needed to be done next. Mary walked over. She held out a mug of hot broth. He took it, took a sip, looked at her. She asked if he'd found what he was looking for. Ethan replied that he had. A plow, an old plow from another world, and the story of a man who was afraid and built a prison, and that now his job isn't just to feed people, but to open the door that was locked 1,000 years ago. Mary looked at him. Then she shook her head. She said he was a strange man. Ethan finished his potion. He set down his mug, rolled up his sleeves, and went out to the field. Because no matter what secrets the forest hides, and no matter what doors lie ahead to be opened, a farmer's first rule remains the same. In the morning, you go out to the field, you check the soil, and you start working.